The protagonist constantly tried to keep up with his brother, but even when he came close, he couldn't match him, which fostered a sense of resentment. The young man was immensely annoyed by the fact that his relative was always ahead of him, staying one step ahead in every endeavor. His brother's excessive friendliness and concern, dictated by their blood ties, only exacerbated the young man's growing discontent. Barely catching his breath after an exhausting chase, the hero realized the full extent of his delusions and misjudgments. He finally admitted to himself that he was an arrogant scoundrel, having previously denied it in every way and considered such words nothing more than a joke. This bitter realization struck him only at that fateful moment when his brother breathed his last. The young man wondered how he could have felt such intense hatred toward his only blood relative. In reality, he passionately desired to be his equal, not to harbor sincere hatred toward him. His brother had selflessly sacrificed himself to save the boy, and now, because of him, his loved one was dead, while he, the worthless one, was still alive. Flying dragons, drawn by the scent of fresh blood, were approaching, anticipating easy prey. With a bitter grimace on his face, the young man realized that imminent death at the fangs of those loathsome beasts was about to befall him. Unable to flee because of his severed limbs, he resolutely drew his sword, preparing for a final desperate battle. The young man, watching the rapidly approaching pack of bloodthirsty monsters, knew that in the end he would die anyway. Facing certain death, he longed to take as many of these hideous creatures with him to the grave as possible. Waiting until the hated beasts flew close enough, the young man swung his sword with a furious cry, ready for battle. Suddenly, a blinding beam descended from the heavens, marking the beginning of something truly incredible and incomprehensible. Stunned and shaken to the core, the young man froze in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. As the bright glow began to gradually fade, the monster's legs and tail came into view before his astonished eyes. Finally, the glow disappeared completely, and the young man was able to see his opponent in detail. A creature resembling a human, but with majestic wings, sharp horns, and a long tail. At the sudden appearance of this mysterious creature, the flying dragons froze in midair, as if paralyzed. The protagonist, just like them, froze in genuine astonishment, trying in vain to make sense of what was happening. The young man muttered something unintelligible in surprise, noticing that his trusty sword had cracked, unable to withstand the strain. By all appearances, the king of dragons himself stood before him, but the young man was absolutely certain he had killed every last one of them. The young man had lost his loyal comrades, fighting shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy, and the pain of loss pierced his heart. He had even lost his beloved brother, yet he was firmly convinced that he had managed to destroy every last one of the dragons of royal blood. However, the boy did not sense the power emanating from the mysterious creature. It seemed strange to him, like a deceptive mirage. The creature, with barely perceptible notes of sadness in its voice, stated that the young man was now completely alone, and the others seemed to be already dead, which was indeed a serious problem. A disturbing thought flashed through the boy's mind that the enemy might turn out to be far more terrifying and powerful than the dreaded Seven Kings, and his eyes clearly reflected the realization of the looming threat and primal fear. The protagonist understood clearly. It didn't matter who exactly stood before him now. The main thing was to destroy the enemy at any cost before it was too late. With these thoughts in mind, the young man resolutely placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, preparing for the decisive battle. The creature suddenly spoke thoughtfully, suggesting a certain course of action, but the young man didn't even bother to listen to its words. Ignoring his opponent's words and overcoming the unbearable pain throughout his body, the young man took another step forward, fully aware that he had only one single chance at salvation. He assumed that this way he would be able to reach his opponent with his weapon and deliver a decisive blow. When he succeeded, the young man realized with complete clarity that he couldn't hesitate for a single second and had to act immediately before the enemy could recover. The creature, noticing that the young man was preparing for a swift attack, muttered, urging him to hold off on the attack for a moment. But it was too late. A deafening sound wave pierced the hero's entire body, causing a distinct and painful sensation as if his flesh were separating from his bones. For a brief moment, a blinding white light flashed before the boy's eyes, forcing him to shut them tight. But immediately, the blinding whiteness began to rapidly give way to something dark and mysterious, resembling a sinister passage into the unknown. The next moment, the young man found himself standing before some beautiful city, which fully confirmed his incredible assumption. He stood there stunned, not knowing how to make sense of what had happened. And then a thought flashed through his mind. Had he really traveled back in time? He recalled his teacher's teachings, which students were required to memorize for a deep understanding of the philosophy of dragon slayers. The mentor insisted that a dragon slayer must exterminate monsters, and his pupils were obliged to live up to this title. The teacher emphasized the importance of the student's mission to destroy the monsters that mercilessly took the lives of innocent people. Whether dragon slaying becomes a calling, a duty, or a pastime, the main thing is to remember the purpose of these creatures' slayers' existence. The academy director solemnly welcomed the new recruits, who had become part of the great Iradium family, his gaze sweeping over the sea of excited faces. The legendary Iradium Academy, founded 7 centuries ago, was rightly considered the best educational institution for training dragon slayers. Looking around, the young man realized that today was the day he was enrolling in the legendary academy. He looked around in fear, trying to figure out where the battlefield had vanished to and where the monster was. Could it all have been just a dream? Confused by what had happened, the hero was most troubled by a strange sensation in his hand, as if it were an echo of the recent battle. Mentally cursing the royal dragons, the hero tried to gather his thoughts and come to terms with his unexpected journey through time. A terrifying memory flashed before the hero's eyes, his brother falling into a bottomless abyss and screaming that Rudd must not let a single one of those vile creatures escape. The mysterious creature pondered the possible consequences of the dragon's complete extermination and the need to wait a while. A tear rolled down the hero's cheek at the thought of returning to the past, for he doubted the existence of such magic. And besides, a dragon could hardly have used it. Doubting the reality of what was happening, the boy tried to figure out if his recent opponent had really been a dragon. Whether it was a demon king or a mutant, it didn't matter. To the young man, they were all just pathetic lizards, destined for extermination. Realizing the uniqueness of his opportunity, the hero vowed to himself to exterminate all dragons, no matter the cost. The young man was determined to prevent the deaths of his brother and comrades, so he immediately pressed forward. Suddenly, someone called out to the young man, causing him to turn around, and genuine surprise flashed across the hero's face. It turned out to be a red-haired girl, anxiously inquiring about his well-being and the reason for his bewildered expression. Instantly recognizing his old friend, the hero recalled her dying words about the need to live for the sake of all his fallen comrades. Carelessly mentioning Hennis Hafley's full name, the young man threw his companion into complete confusion with his knowledge of her. Surprised by the young man's knowledge of her, the girl asked him about it, causing the protagonist to shudder inwardly at the fear of altering the course of events. Trying to explain his knowledge, the hero cited Hennis's high grades among the freshmen, frantically coming up with an excuse. Still slightly confused, the girl agreed with the young man's statement, puzzled as to the source of his knowledge. Hennis explained her concern by noting that she had seen the young man talking to himself and cursing, assuming he had a mental disorder. Turning around, Hennis remarked with a laugh that crazy people rarely ended up in Iradium, and although everyone here was of average intelligence, this was the first time she'd seen a real nutcase. Hennis's sarcasm and bluntness evoked warm feelings in the young man, reminding him of the old days and intensifying the sensation of returning to the past. Offended by the young man's smile, Hennis suspected him of having perverted tendencies, forcing Rudd to hastily apologize for his strange behavior. Hafley, having softened somewhat after the young man's sincere apology, noted his realization of the absurdity of his behavior. The sudden start of the formal entrance ceremony interrupted their conversation, and all the students were asked to stand. One of the academy's administrators began reading a solemn speech about the realization of the dreams and hopes of those who had entered the walls of Iradium. The red-haired girl, stretching and sitting back down, pointed out the tedious length of the speeches, with a slight sigh of weariness. Hennis stared intently at Ruda, not taking her eyes off him, trying to unravel the mystery of his unusual behavior and strange knowledge about her. The young man understood the need to satisfy Hennis's curiosity, realizing that ignoring her would only intensify her persistence and suspicions. Agreeing with the girl's remark, Rudd heard from her about the importance of patience as the primary skill of true mages. Sincerely impressed by Hennis's words, the hero recalled how, in his past life, he had been struck by her outstanding magical abilities. The girl, proud of her affiliation with the renowned Hafley family of mages, asked the strange newcomer his name, introducing himself as Rude Donatos. He also mentioned that he had come from the remote village of Disol, which she had likely never heard of. The girl arrogantly declared that this was the first time she had heard the young man's surname or the name of his village, expressing surprise at how he had managed to enroll at Iradium. Hennis muttered that the boy must be completely ignorant, but immediately covered her mouth with her hand. realizing she had said something offensive again. Hafley recalled her mother's advice about the need to behave nobly, even toward fools who would never reach her family's social standing. For it was precisely because of her manner of speaking that Hennis often quarreled with her mother. Glancing at her companion, who sat there unperturbed, the girl surmised that her words apparently hadn't particularly hurt his feelings, which puzzled her somewhat. Trying to gracefully extricate herself from the awkward situation, Hennis cleared her throat slightly and offered her help in case the young man didn't know something. Pointing to the opposite side, the girl explained that the people on the second tier were the leaders of well-known guilds. Hennis explained how guild leaders scout out and evaluate the most promising students well in advance for future collaboration. She mentioned the Sacred Fire Guild, one of the most prestigious organizations in the world of dragon slayers. Then, Hennis mentioned the Dull Moon Guild, known for its unique methods of fighting dragons. Rudd inquired about the presence of the leader of the Pursuer Guild, well aware of the future achievements and tragic fate of these organizations. Hennis began to talk about the possibility of receiving an assignment in her third year, but Rudd interrupted her, having guessed her choice. Sacred Fire. The girl confirmed Rudd's guess, but emphasized that she had chosen this guild not only because of its top ranking. Hennis spoke admiringly of the leader of Sacred Fire, Empress of the White Flame Liana Chernik, her role model. The girl admired Liana, a top-tier fire mage who wielded the rarest white flame, considering her an unrivaled master. The young man recalled that in the future, Liana would fall at the hands of the Dragon King, and her place would be taken by Hennis, who, consumed by vengeance, would ultimately set herself on fire while attempting to avenge the death of her revered mentor. The hero confidently declared that Hafley would certainly join the Sacred Fire, concealing his knowledge of her future within that organization. Hennis, flattered by Rudd's confidence, winked at him with a smile, considering her admission to the guild a done deal. Suddenly, a call rang out from the stage for Hennis to recite the oath, and the girl made her way there, while Rudd noted to himself that everything was unfolding exactly as in his memories of the past. The hero thought that if his memory served him correctly, his brother should be next to come out, and, remembering him, he clenched his fists tightly, keeping his hands on his knees. Rudd remembered his brother Asir with bitterness, the student council president, an exceptional warrior who had died saving his younger brother. However, instead of his brother, the president of the student council, Jeremy Duville, took the stage, and his name came as a huge surprise to the protagonist. Jeremy delivered a welcoming speech and told the freshmen about the global threat of dragons ravaging entire nations. Jeremy emphasized the Academy's status as the premier institution for training dragon slayers, while the protagonist, listening intently, tried to make sense of what was happening. Duville emphasized that students must live up to the high calling of dragon slayers, regardless of whether it is their vocation, a mission, or a pastime. Rudd was lost in memories of childhood battles with his brother, which invariably ended in his defeat, and Asir's jokes that frequent blinking would accelerate the younger brother's growth. A thought flashed through Rudd's mind about a possible role reversal. His brother could be the student council president and Jeremy Duville, his best friend in this reality. Deciding to check his class schedule, Rudd headed away, ignoring Hennis's surprised exclamation as she asked about his sudden departure. Determined to follow the current student council president, Rudd approached and called out to Jeremy, intending to clarify the situation. The hero pounced on the guy and began excitedly questioning him about his brother, Asir Donatos, convinced that he was supposed to be the student council president. Trying to free himself from Rudd's firm grip, Jeremy cautiously suggested that the aforementioned Asir might be a member of the student council, though he didn't know him personally. Jeremy, maintaining a friendly tone, asked Rudd to explain the situation, admitting that this was the first time he'd heard the name Asir Donatos, which puzzled the young man even more. Stunned by Jeremy's response, Rudd froze in amazement, unable to believe that his brother's best friend didn't remember him. Taking advantage of Rudd's confusion, Jeremy hurried away, leaving the young man alone with troubling thoughts about his past and his missing brother. A terrible thought flashed through Rudd's mind. Perhaps Asira Donatos, his brother and the greatest warrior, simply did not exist in this world, a notion that seemed unimaginable and terrifying. A bell rang signaling the end of the orientation ceremony, and all the freshmen were asked to proceed to their classrooms. The hero, stunned by his own assumption, could not believe the possibility that his brother might not exist in this world, considering such an idea utterly implausible. However, accepting the possibility that his hunch might be true, Rudd realized with horror that Asir Donatos might have completely vanished from this reality. An alternative version of events suggested that Asir, having returned to the past with his memories of the future intact, simply hadn't shown up at the academy. Walking into the classroom and taking his seat, The young man pondered which of the two possibilities was true, and if the second turned out to be the case, then it would be for the best. Hennis, noticing Rudd's pensive mood, approached him and asked the reason for his serious thoughts, trying to unravel the mystery of her new acquaintance. The girl moved close to the young man, leaned on the desk, and found herself face to face with him, waiting for his answer with obvious curiosity. He cautiously explained that he was looking for a specific person, possibly a student at the academy, to which Hennis suggested he contact the Information Guild. The girl continued to list options, mentioning that one could look up student rosters in the library. Without waiting for her to finish, Rudd jumped up again, which annoyed Hennis, who was indignant at his behavior and regretted giving him advice. The guy headed to the library, and Hennis followed him, reminding him that there was little time left before classes started and expressing her displeasure at his desire to be late on the very first day. Donato said he hadn't asked her to follow him, at which point his classmate calmed down a bit and replied that she was just going to see if the young man had something in mind. Hennis, making no attempt to hide her bewilderment, asked her friend about the reasons for his strange argument with the student council president, to which the young man calmly replied that he had simply asked a question. Continuing to follow Rudd, the classmate kept criticizing his behavior, suspecting he had a mental disorder and attention deficit. Noticing that Rudd was heading in the wrong direction, Hennis sarcastically asked if he even knew where the library was, calling him an idiot in the process. Taking the initiative, Halfley led him down the stairs, confidently heading toward the library. Approaching the right door, the girl cautiously pushed it open and, peering inside, couldn't hold back an enthusiastic exclamation, struck by what she saw. Her admiration was sparked by the incredible beauty of the central library, which surpassed all her expectations and imagination. Upon entering, her companion, unable to hide her delight, looked around at everything, admitting that she had long dreamed of visiting here, which prompted Ruta to ask about her familiarity with the place. Hennis replied sarcastically to her friend's question, saying that any sensible person should study the layout of important places in the academy before enrolling. The young man, having sarcastically praised Hennis, noted to himself that in his past life, he simply hadn't visited the library, which was why he didn't know its location. Stepping away from his companion, he strained his eyes and began searching intently for the right list, hoping to find information about his brother. Walking over to one of the bookshelves, Rudd began browsing through the books, only to discover that this section contained information about the academy's former students. The girl, exploring the neighboring shelf, excitedly discovered rare editions, including the Ertany Herb Guide and the first edition of Understanding Magic, which were unavailable in regular stores. While Hennis marveled at her finds, the protagonist picked up one of the books and began searching for the name Asir, but, to his disappointment, did not find it in the lists. The ancient dragon Sartnan, the king of dragons, capable of controlling time and dimensions. Rudd recalled that in the final battle before his return to the past, Sartnan had vanished along with his brother's body, which raised new questions. Closing the book, the boy hoped that if the dragon hadn't died but had moved to another dimension, there was a chance his brother was alive too. Turning to call out to Hennis, Rudd discovered that the girl wasn't nearby and began searching for her among the library's numerous shelves. A few steps away from the shelves, a scene unfolded before the young man. The girl was arguing with the librarian, indignant at the rule prohibiting her from taking 17 books. The librarian patiently explained the rules, allowing a maximum of 3 books at a time, and reminded the freshman that classes were about to begin. Hennis grabbed 3 books and, shouting for Ruta to wait for her, hurried after him, aware of the risk of being late for the first class. They sprinted down the empty hallway and, bursting into their classroom, realized with relief that they had made it just in time. Halfley, tossing her books onto the desk and sinking wearily into a chair, asked her friend if he had found the person he was looking for, suggesting alternative ways to search. Rudd replied briefly that he was looking for his brother, while the teacher began greeting the students, calling for attention and order in the classroom. The professor introduced himself as Daniel Gould and announced that he would be teaching a course on combat for the coming year. He also added that he would be their homeroom teacher, and if the students enrolled in weaponry or combat classes, they would see him more often. The professor warned that the path to becoming a true dragon slayer would not be easy, comparing the training to passing through all the circles of hell. While some female students admired the top-ranked student, Gould described the structure of the program: practical training in guilds during the 3rd year, writing a thesis and taking an exam in the 4th, emphasizing the need for diligence and talent. Listening intently to the professor, Rudd concluded that without innate abilities, even the most diligent efforts might prove useless. He recalled how much humiliation and abuse he had to endure in his past life, just to prove he had even a modicum of talent. Concluding the introductory lecture, the homeroom teacher wished the students many fond memories over the next 4 years of study. The students decided to seize the moment and ask their homeroom teacher about the dorm room assignments, eager to settle into their new surroundings as quickly as possible. Halfley, noticing that Rudd was heading off somewhere again, called out to him irritably, pointing out that the dormitory was on the opposite side. The girl thought ironically that the hero didn't know where the library was, but he knew where the dormitory was, and she got a little angry at her new friend. The hero mentally repeated the Dragon Slayer's primary task, the literal destruction of these mighty creatures, as he resolutely headed off somewhere. He understood that no matter what the battle, a fighter's physical condition always plays a paramount role in achieving victory. The academy grounds were equipped with numerous training halls, allowing students to constantly develop their physical abilities, and the protagonist often visited them. Approaching one of the halls, Rudd peered inside and noted with satisfaction that everything looked exactly as it did in his memories. Taking off his jacket, the young man decided to test his current physical capabilities, starting with basic exercises on the horizontal bar. The first 10 pull-ups came relatively easily to Rudd, but after the 20th, he was sweating profusely, feeling beads of sweat trickling down his body. After completing 30 pull-ups, the boy jumped down to the floor and sat down immediately, feeling exhausted and realizing just how weak his body had become. He understood that for a 17-year-old teenager, such a result was quite natural, but he was dissatisfied with his current physical condition. Realizing that there was only a week left before the start of combat and battle training, Rudd understood that there was catastrophically little time to prepare. To avoid repeating the mistakes of his past life, Donatos decided to achieve better results than before by focusing on developing muscle strength and endurance. As he continued his warm-up, the young man suddenly heard someone enter the hall. Turning around, he was surprised to recognize a familiar figure, not expecting to run into him so soon. The newcomer turned out to be another of Ruda's comrades from his past life, Balak Steros, a fighter who would one day bear the title King Without Weapons. Rudd was surprised to realize that something didn't add up. In his previous life, he hadn't run into Balak at the gym before the midterm exam. Deciding not to dwell on the possible confusion in time, the young man chose to focus on his physical training, avoiding unnecessary interference in the course of events. Picking up the dumbbells, the protagonist began his exercises, but noticed that his new acquaintance, watching him, had started copying his movements. Moving on to the pull-up bar with added weight, Rudd was astonished to find that Steros had followed his lead, but chosen a significantly heavier load. As he began his barbell exercises, Donato saw Balak copying his movements again, which was becoming increasingly irritating. Unable to take it anymore, the young man threw the barbell on the floor and, furious, asked his rival loudly if he was doing this on purpose to get under his skin. Without looking up from his attempts to lift the enormous weight, Steros calmly replied that he was simply working out, ignoring his companion's indignation. Balak apologized for any possible misunderstanding and explained that he had been repeating the movements because of their perfection and precision. Surprised, Donatos asked again and received confirmation. Rudd's weightlifting technique and shoulder work were flawless. Flaunting his muscles, the new acquaintance asked if Rudd was a god of sports, given the perfection of his movements. Introducing himself as a freshman, the protagonist learned that Balak had also enrolled in the academy's first year. Impressed, Steros announced that from now on, Rudd would be his training mentor, and asked permission to call himself his student. Annoyed by such insistence, the protagonist flatly refused the proposed role of teacher. In the open stadium number 3, instructions were being given on the importance of choosing a primary weapon, which influences one's fighting style. Professor Daniel encouraged the students to try new types of weapons, not limiting themselves to the familiar ones. As the students selected their equipment, they were surprised by the lightness of the swords, assuming they had been specially crafted for novice fighters. Discussing the quality of the weapons, the novices noted their suitability for real combat after a little refinement. A red-haired girl approached the instructor to ask about the necessity of choosing a weapon for a future mage. After receiving an affirmative answer and advice on the importance of weapon proficiency, even for mages, Halfley approached the display, carefully examining the arsenal on offer. Rudd quietly recommended that his friend choose a dagger, noting how easy it was to carry and the ability to magically alter the blade's size. Recalling Hennis's mastery of the dagger in close combat in his past life, the young man was convinced that his advice was sound. The delighted girl chose the dagger that caught her eye, examining its details and features with interest. Noticing the sword in Ruda's hands, Hennis asked if he intended to use that particular weapon. Instead of answering, The young man sharply drew the blade from its sheath, demonstrating his confident mastery of the sword. Surprised by her friend's quick decision, she remarked that others put on quite a show, trying to get a feel for the weapon. Unaware of his homeroom teacher's observation and admiration, Rudd casually noted that the sword was merely for training, downplaying his skills. Hennis suggested looking at other options, but the young man confidently declared the high quality of the entire arsenal on display. A professor who appeared unexpectedly noted Rudd's skill, after which Rudd inquired about the possibility of choosing several types of weapons. Gould explained that there were no strict restrictions, but emphasized the effectiveness of focusing on a single type of weapon. Pondering whether the student's attitude stemmed from boldness or overconfidence, the instructor decided to observe him and allowed him to choose an additional weapon. Without hesitation, the young man took a spear and demonstrated a confident swing, assessing the balance of the new weapon. Not content to stop there, Rudd chose a sword, demonstrating masterful skill with this type of blade as well. Having felt the power and characteristics of all three types of weapons, the student resolutely declared his intention to take them all. The professor, observing the proceedings, noted to himself the unusual nature and possible genius of his new student. Daniel pondered the source of Rudd's elegant movements, admiring the precision and finesse of every swing. Intrigued, the mentor approached the novice and cautiously inquired about his life before entering the academy. The student, with a touch of sadness and reluctance, spoke of his work as a mercenary and the loss of his family to dragons, eliciting sympathy from the teacher and an apology for the tactless question. The teacher's praise did not go unnoticed. Ruda, standing nearby, remarked irritably that his behavior was infuriating her. Hennis, recalling the mention of the loss of his family, asked fearfully if this referred to both of the young man's parents. Pausing, but without turning to face her, the hero briefly confirmed the death of his loved ones. Suddenly hugging her friend, the girl burst into tears, apologizing for her tactlessness, to which Rudd calmly replied, reminding her that the events had happened long ago. Reflecting on Hennis's complex nature, the young man stared intently at her, prompting a puzzled question about the reason for such attention. Noticing the commotion in Class B, Hafley asked what was going on, breaking away from their private conversation. The argument between the students was heating up. One insisted on the mandatory selection of a weapon, while the other claimed that his body was the only tool necessary. Trying to reason with Balak, his opponent mentioned the possibility of using at least gloves, but Steros vehemently denied the need for any equipment. Refusing to back down, the fighter once again shouted about his refusal to use weapons, demonstrating his unwavering stance. Balak's interlocutor, making no attempt to hide his anger and fury, tried to dissuade the stubborn newcomer, but to no avail. Watching the conflict, Hennis asked Ruda if he knew the jerk, to which he replied in the negative. The professor, trying to defuse the situation, pulled the angry student away from Steros, who was already seeking support from his supposed friends. Seeing Balak wave his hand in their direction, Donatos was inwardly outraged by such a familiar gesture. Immediately after the greeting, the wrestler rushed toward Rudd and Hennis, while the professor tried to calm the student, who was eager to vent his anger at Balak. Noticing Steros approaching, Hafley asked her companion about a possible friendship, but he pretended not to know the approaching young man. The outraged student shouted after Balak about his disrespect toward the professor speaking with him, hinting at inappropriate behavior. Before he could finish his sentence about a deeper relationship, the wrestler was interrupted by Rudd, who unexpectedly confirmed their friendship. Trying to calm the situation, the mentor explained to Steros the importance of choosing a weapon as part of the educational process, despite possible family traditions. Recalling his past life, the protagonist suggested the possibility of creating new rules and regulations within the academy to resolve such situations. However, the conclusion of the instructor's speech was unexpected. He mentioned the possibility of being held back a year, which greatly surprised the protagonist. Ruda's shock stemmed from the realization of possible changes in the past, which forced him to rethink his actions and plans. The professor's warning about the possibility of repeating the year due to his refusal to use weapons caused Ruda to worry about altering the past and the future composition of the squad against the Dragon King. Steros, true to his principles, was ready to sacrifice his reputation and repeat the course, but Donatos abruptly cut him off, covering his mouth with his hand. Rudd, continuing to cover Balak's mouth, asked the professor to make an exception, but was refused to avoid unfairness toward the other students. Surprised by the discrepancy with his past life, the hero decided to find a suitable weapon for his friend and headed toward the equipment rack. Spotting gloves among the weapons, the young man tossed them to Balak, offering an unexpected solution to the problem. Upon finding the gloves, the protagonist tossed them to Steros, insisting he use them. Balak, claiming that wrestlers do not use weapons, refused to accept the gloves until Rudd convinced him that they were protective gear and ordered him to take the gift from his friend. Surprised by the word friend, Steros pressed the gloves to his chest, rethinking the situation and his attitude toward what was happening. A student who had previously clashed with Balak protested that gloves were not weapons, but Rudd insisted otherwise, citing their modern use. Stunned by the unexpected support, Balak froze in place, repeating the word friend and processing what had happened. Aware of the teacher's presence, the homeroom teacher hurried to resolve the conflict, acknowledging the unusual nature of the gloves chosen. Rudd, realizing that they had barely managed to avoid trouble this time, reminded himself of the need for caution as his actions could affect the future. Studying the information on the sheet, the young man noted the small number of students, assuming that this was typical of the first day of classes at the academy. The predominance of theoretical subjects in the schedule might also have contributed to the smaller crowd of students in the hallway. The first week at Irradium served as a period for newcomers to adapt and for instructors to assess their potential for future recommendations to the guild. Donatos, having already taken steps to make a good impression and secure favorable recommendations, focused on preparing for practical training after the battles. Heading to the office accompanied by Balak and Hennis, the young man was puzzled by their relaxed demeanor following the recent conflict. Steros, defending the honor of the fighters, got into an argument with Halfley, who didn't understand his principles and found his behavior strange. Suddenly, a rude remark rang out toward the arguing pair, forcing them to stop talking and turn around. A group of students standing in front of them provocatively addressed Rudd and his companions, using crude insults. Donatos, who had been studying a leaflet until that moment, looked up and asked if they were addressing him, to which he received an affirmative answer laced with new insults. Outraged, Hennis intervened in the conflict, demanding an explanation and defending her friends from the unjust attacks. One of the strangers, recognizing Halfley from her speech at the ceremony, introduced himself as William Farday from Class B and stated he had no complaints against her, extending his hand. The girl, refusing to make his acquaintance, called William an idiot, provoking his indignation and criticism of her choice of company. An angry Hennis continued to stand her ground until Rudd intervened, pushing the girl aside and asking what the offender wanted. Fart, making no attempt to hide his hostility, demanded that the hero calm down and stop trying to curry favor with the instructors. The student from Class B continued to criticize Rudd and his friends for their choice of weapons and behavior, advising them to leave the academy due to their inappropriate attitude. The protagonist, reflecting on his opponent's words, admitted that he had indeed intentionally drawn attention to himself with his actions. Memories of his past life flooded back to Rudd, reminding him of similar conflicts when he tried not to stand out among the other students. Cruel taunts and insults he had endured in the past came to mind, targeting his background and abilities. Speculation that he'd gotten in through connections was replaced by taunts about his lack of parents capable of pulling strings for him. Donatos recalled how, in the past, full of energy, he had taken such provocations seriously and readily fought back. But now, striving to act like an adult, the young man held back his emotions and calmly stated Balak's superiority over William, regardless of the weapon. Continuing the provocation, Rudd added that both he and Hennis could easily handle the offender with their bare hands, heightening the tension of the situation. Enraged, William, unable to contain his fury, shouted an insult, demonstrating his inability to control his emotions. Farty, having completely lost his composure, accused Rudd of seeking attention and swung at him. By deftly dodging the attack with a simple step backward, the protagonist demonstrated his superior reflexes, and the blow missed its mark. Having misjudged the force of his swing, William lost his balance and fell, ending up in a ridiculous position in front of the spectators. Hennis, unable to contain herself, laughed at her hapless opponent, compounding his humiliation and anger. Lying on the floor, Fart flushed with rage and shame, having completely lost control of his emotions. Realizing he needed to restore his reputation, William got up and reached for his sword, preparing to demonstrate his strength. Halfley loudly warned against the use of weapons outside of training matches, trying to prevent the conflict from escalating. Ignoring the warning, the enraged student ordered her to shut up and swung his sword decisively, intending to attack. Rudd, realizing the attack was aimed at him, remained calm and didn't move from his spot. Calling his opponent a pathetic bastard, the young man watched as the weapon approached his face and applied a technique he had learned from Balak in his past life. Masterfully applying the Steros style, Donatos easily knocked the sword out of the attacker's hands, shocking everyone present with his skill. Not content to stop there, the young man decided to take revenge, rapidly closing the distance to his opponent. Seeing Rudd approaching, genuine terror flashed in William's eyes, and he screamed in panic. In a flash, Donatos was right beside him and delivered a powerful blow to his assailant's head, demonstrating his superiority. Fart, thrown back toward his stunned friends, collapsed to the floor, and Rudd declared that this would be a lesson for him. Balak, watching the scene unfold, recognized his family's signature move in Rudd's technique, which gave him pause for deep thought. The professor rushed to the scene, demanding an explanation of what was happening and why a student was lying on the floor. Upon recognizing the participants, the professor ordered Rudd to step aside, while one of William's friends accused the group of assault. Hennis and Balak stood up for their friend, explaining the situation and emphasizing that he had merely defended himself against unprovoked aggression and without a weapon. The teacher was amazed that the freshman had managed to overpower his opponent with his bare hands without sustaining a single scratch, and she ordered that Farte be taken to the infirmary. Turning to Rudd, the professor scheduled a meeting with him after class in the faculty lounge to discuss the incident. The defeated student's friends threatened revenge as they dragged him to the doctor, while Halfley asked her friend what technique he had used. Donatos' answer about parrying raised further questions among his friends, and Balak even suggested that perhaps Rudd was his long-hidden brother. Realizing he couldn't reveal the truth about his past, the protagonist began to deny his friend's assumptions. Unable to come up with a better explanation, Rudd declared his own genius, which drew skeptical reactions from Hennis and Balak. Unsatisfied with the answer, his friends continued to insist on an honest explanation, suspecting that their friend was hiding something. Balak tried to defend Rudd's right to privacy, but Halfley continued to doubt the sincerity of their newfound friendship. Balak calmly replied that they had just become friends and politely greeted Hennis, to which she muttered through clenched teeth that he was a real jerk. Walking down the hallway, the protagonist listened to his friend's argument behind him when a group ahead caught his attention. A group of fire mages sitting at a table and engaged in a playful banter suddenly captured Rudd's full attention. The boy froze in place, staring at the mages, until his friends reminded him of the risk of being late for class and the need to hurry. Rudd, reflecting on the past and the future, confidently declared that no one would die this time and followed his friends to class. After a conversation in the faculty office, the teacher let Rudd go to rest, pondering his suspicious luck and the need for further investigation into the situation. Pouring herself some coffee, the teacher continued to analyze what had happened, doubting the need for further investigation and trying to understand the young man's true motives. Recalling Ruda's sincere apology from 20 minutes earlier, the teacher tried to objectively assess his behavior and intentions, weighing the pros and cons. The young man explained his actions in detail, saying he was defending his friends from insults and the threat of a weapon, admitting that in the heat of the conflict, he had misjudged his strength and overreacted. Despite the obvious exaggeration in Ruda's account, his sincerity and remorse for his childish behavior deeply moved the teacher, causing her to reconsider her initial opinion. The teacher felt a pleasant sense of joy at the arrival of such a well-mannered and kind student at the academy, which instilled hope for a bright future for the new generation. Suddenly remembering William and his inappropriate behavior, she became angry and decided to give him a rigorous training session as punishment and a lesson for the future. The teacher's thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected knock on the door, signaling the arrival of her colleagues for the scheduled meeting. Daniel Gould, upon entering the office, reminded everyone of the upcoming meeting of first-year teachers, explaining his presence and clarifying the details of the upcoming meeting. A lighthearted conversation began among the colleagues about the reasons for choosing the meeting location, touching on the topics of stubbornness and laziness when it comes to organizational matters. The teacher, laughing, denied being stubborn about organizing the meeting, trying to steer the conversation in a more constructive direction. The cheerful atmosphere was interrupted by the arrival of new meeting participants: Arthur Winston, homeroom teacher for Class D, and Damian Grace, homeroom teacher for Class C. As soon as Arthur Winston stepped into the classroom, he launched into a tirade against the teacher, accusing her of overspending on classroom decorations. Damian Grace, unable to resist, mentioned the secret purchase of a delphinium flower for 3 million ribbles, but immediately received a stern look from his colleague, reminding him of the confidential nature of that information. Winston, having calmed down a bit, changed the subject, asking why the professor had forgotten about the scheduled meeting. The teacher's attempt to joke her way out of it, hinting at a connection between Arthur's meticulousness and his bald spot, was abruptly cut short, forcing her to hastily retract her words. Daniel, seeking to diffuse the tense atmosphere, suggested starting the meeting on a positive note, urging his colleagues to remain calm and engage in constructive dialogue. Gould noted that this year's freshmen were better prepared than last year's class, a point supported by Winston. The teacher made an important point, reminding her colleagues of potential issues with students' mental health. Despite their strong skills and preparation, finishing her coffee, she continued her thought and emphasized the key role of teachers in fostering not only the professional, but also the personal growth of students. The homeroom teacher for Class D expressed interest in identifying students who require special attention and support from the teaching staff. Grace noted the high overall level of his class, while the professor pointed out the presence in her group of one underachiever and one psychologically unstable student. Arthur, surprised by his colleague's choice of words, asked her to clarify who she meant by lagging behind and psycho, trying to make sense of the situation. The teacher explained that she was referring to Balak Steros, who showed a stark contrast between his terrible written exam results and his brilliant performance on practical assignments. The professor, reviewing Balak's personal file, inquired about his possible connection to a well-known family renowned for its athletic achievements. Daniel, studying the information about Steros, expressed enthusiasm about the upcoming meeting with this talented and extraordinary student. The homeroom teacher, continuing the discussion of talented newcomers, mentioned two rising stars in his class, starting with Hennis Halfley from the famous family of mages. The second outstanding student named was Rude Donatos, whose name piqued the interest of the teachers present. Discussing the girl's prospects, the teachers speculated that she would soon be accepted into the elite guild, while Arthur was curious about the background of the second talented student. Gould, intriguing his colleagues, suggested they personally review the young man's file, handing them the document and emphasizing the uniqueness of the case. As they studied the papers, the professors noted with surprise the average results of the written and practical exams, as well as the student's tragic past. Anticipating his colleagues' reaction, Daniel stated his conviction that the young man could become the strongest among the freshmen, which drew their close attention. Intrigued, Arthur asked his colleague, who had already had the opportunity to observe the student, about her impressions and assessment of his abilities. Recalling her meeting with Rudd, the teacher spoke with a smile about his good manners, loyalty to his friends, and outstanding qualities, expressing a desire to transfer him to her class. Surprised by her colleague's reaction, the teacher asked why they looked so puzzled, not realizing that her enthusiasm had come as a surprise to them. Explaining her position, she recounted the conflict in which Rudd had distinguished himself by subduing an aggressive student with his bare hands. One of the professors, pointing to the information in the documents, expressed surprise that Rudd had used a sword during the exam, but had demonstrated hand-to-hand combat skills in a real-life situation. The professor, emphasizing her specialization in hand-to-hand combat, offered to take on Rudd's training, considering this the most effective way to develop his talents. Gould objected, insisting on his right to train the young man, citing his skills with the spear and sword. A heated debate ensued over who had first recognized Rudd's potential, and who was more competent to train him, escalating from arguments to personal attacks. The dispute between the instructors escalated to the point of threats to settle the score, as they recalled past conflicts and rivalries between themselves. Professor Winston, unable to bear his colleagues' bickering, loudly called them to order, slamming his fist on the table. Arthur's blow was so strong that the expensive table split in two, causing the professor to express her outrage over the loss of the valuable item. Trying to diffuse the tension, Winston turned to his colleague for his opinion on the situation. Damien, doubting his suitability as a mentor due to his intimidating appearance, chose to refrain from participating in the debate over Rudd's mentorship. Arthur, trying to calm his heated colleagues, reminded them of the upcoming sparring matches and the need to draft recommendations, suggesting they postpone the decision. Continuing his conciliatory speech, Winston began picking up papers from the floor and emphasized the student's right to choose his own mentor. Looking again at Rudd's personal file, the professor noted his origins in Dissol, which required further explanation regarding the fate of that place. He explained to his colleagues the tragedy of the heavenly cataclysm that had occurred 10 years ago in southern Caliban, as a result of which half the kingdom's territory had vanished, leading to its decline and disappearance from the map. A single dragon, possessing the ability to shapeshift, a trait that made it particularly dangerous, was responsible for the destruction of an entire village. Daniel, recalling his participation in the raid against one of the 7 great dragons, the celestial dragon Kyanil, sadly acknowledged his inexperience. While discussing Gould's miraculous survival, the professors noted that Dysel was one of many villages that had suffered. The fact that there were survivors in a completely burned-down settlement caused surprise, prompting the professors to reflect on the unusual fate of their new student. Gould suggested that a thirst for revenge for the tragedy he had endured might have been the driving force behind the development of Rudd's extraordinary abilities, allowing him to stand up to even experienced fighters. Reflecting on the student's uniqueness as the sole survivor with incredible abilities, Winston interrupted his colleague's reasoning, intending to make an important clarification. The homeroom teacher for Class A, surprised by Arthur's interruption, asked why he had cut off his thoughts on the new student's potential. Professor Winston, addressing Daniel, asked if he truly believed Ruda to be the strongest among the freshmen. However, he immediately noted that there was another genius in Class D who possessed incredible skills and talents. William, having received a severe punishment, had already completed 3 sets of 200 push-ups, demonstrating physical endurance and discipline. The professor, unsatisfied with the work done, assigned an additional exercise, 2,000 burpees in 8 sets, eliciting a shocked reaction from the exhausted student. Meanwhile, the protagonist, like the other students, was in a self-training session, honing his skills and physical fitness. After finishing his bench press exercises and returning the barbell to its rack, Rudd noted with satisfaction the progress in his training, feeling that he had finally reached an acceptable level. There were 3 days left until the match, and the young man seemed to have already recalled the breathing and movement techniques from his past life. Wiping the sweat from his face, Rudd tried to convince himself that he could achieve his goals thanks to his intense training and regained skills. Annoyed by the noisy behavior of his friend training nearby, the protagonist asked him to be quieter, but received in response a philosophical remark about the connection between strength and breathing. Without interrupting his exercises, Balak warned Rudd that he lacked the strength to lift a certain weight, showing concern for his friend's safety. Donatos told Steros to get into the correct posture first and then speak, since every time he snorts, he leans to one side. The protagonist's student, having corrected his mistake, noted that his muscles were indeed being stimulated more effectively. The wrestler, having finished the exercises, expressed sincere admiration for Ruda's skill, calling him his unrivaled teacher. Hennis, wrinkling her nose at the smell of sweat, criticized the intensity of her friend's workouts, but received in response philosophical musings on the joy of physical exertion and a remark about her thinness. Balak, offering to help her with her training, received a sharp refusal, after which he carelessly compared the local girls to starving stray dogs. Enraged by the comparison to stray dogs, the red-haired girl lunged at Steros, ready to defend her honor. Taking advantage of his friend's argument, Rudd decided to slip away quietly, but was spotted. When asked where he was going, he replied that he wanted to buy something to drink. Hennis decided to keep her friend company, while Balak stayed in the hall, asking for a protein shake to help him recover from an intense workout. As they approached the drink machine, the friends were surprised to find that someone had beaten them to it, spotting an unfamiliar figure. Standing before them was a girl with long white hair, leisurely sipping an energy drink. Rudd instantly recognized her as Lion Claire, the legendary swordswoman with devilish skills, the strongest warrior and dragon slayer, comparable in strength to his brother. Memories of his past defeat at Lion's hands flooded the hero, evoking mixed feelings of respect and a desire to overcome this gulf in skill. The protagonist ordered the stranger to get out of the way, greatly surprising Halfley with his aggression. There was no reaction, so he ordered the stranger again to get out of the way, asking if she had wax in her ears. Lion's irritation grew. She took another sip and began to squeeze the drink can tightly, preparing for a confrontation. Unable to withstand the aggression directed at her, the girl suddenly hurled the can at the young man with all her might. The protagonist, demonstrating razor-sharp reflexes, easily dodged the can flying toward him. As he turned to see where the projectile had landed, Lion launched a lightning-fast kick at his face. Rudd, displaying incredible reflexes, managed to block the blow, greatly surprising the attacker, who hadn't expected such skill. Refusing to give up, her opponent quickly freed her leg and prepared to land another blow, this time a more serious one. Lion, swinging her leg for a new strike, defiantly challenged Ruda to try and block this attack as well, testing his skills and reflexes. The protagonist easily managed to block the strike again, shocking both Lion, who was surprised by his success, and Hennis, who was stunned by the whole situation. Realizing that she wasn't dealing with just some idiot, since he'd managed to dodge her blows twice, the girl calmed down. Stopping the fight, she pounced on the young man with accusations, assuming that Rude had come to mock her for getting into the academy on a recommendation. The protagonist, annoyed by the situation, snapped back that he just wanted to buy a drink, and Lion blocked him with her gun, trying to clear up the misunderstanding. Despite the fact that the stranger continued to stand in a fighting stance, Donatos persistently repeated his request for her to step aside so he could buy a drink. Finally clearing the way to the vending machine, Lion allowed the young man to approach his desired goal. Realizing her mistake and assessing the situation, feeling awkward about her mistaken attack on the young man, she asked his name, to which he, without looking up from his drink and with his back to her, introduced himself as Rude Donatos. The blonde girl promised to remember his name and headed for the exit, hearing an indifferent "as you wish" in response. Hennis, still upset by what had happened, called out after the departing Lion, demanding an apology and asking about her identity. It later turned out that Rudd's actions were part of a cunning plan. He had deliberately provoked the conflict to gauge the difference in their strength, which turned out to be so great that she nearly broke his arm. Concerned, Hennis began asking her teammate about his well-being and possible injuries, insisting on a visit to the infirmary despite his assurances that he was unharmed. Returning to the training hall after the examination, they encountered a surprised Balak, who asked if his friend had really injured his arm. A female professor passing by upon hearing about the possible injury immediately ran up to the young man, asking with concern and sympathy what had happened. At the shout of Class B's homeroom teacher, Professor Daniel came running over, and Hennis, without waiting for a question, blurted out that some girl had suddenly started kicking and hitting Ruda. The protagonist tried to defuse the situation, insisting that it was just a minor scuffle and that no one had beaten him up. Hafley readily described the freshman with silver hair and yellow eyes, who had been admitted on a recommendation, ignoring the protagonist's attempts to stop her. Upon hearing the description, the homeroom teachers exchanged glances, immediately realizing that they were talking about Lion Claire from Class D. The enraged teacher suggested sorting out the situation immediately, but Daniel tried to calm her down, urging a more measured approach. The professor's loud outbursts caught the attention of all the students in the hall, sparking a wave of rumors and discussions about the incident. Daniel, trying to defuse the situation, smiled and agreed that such behavior should not be tolerated, but suggested finding a more reasonable way to resolve the issue, as befits a teacher. In a whisper, Daniel advised her to first contact Lion's father, the leader of the Dead Dragon Guild, to avoid a direct conflict with Class D and its leader. The professor, grasping the essence of the plan, clarified whether Gould was suggesting shifting the blame onto Arthur and gaining the right to punish Lion themselves. Daniel confirmed his idea, suggesting they limit themselves to demerit points, community service, and extra study hours, hinting at the possibility of going beyond the usual punishment. Miss Claire was delighted with her colleague's idea, while the protagonist was burning with shame, considering what had happened a disgrace. Balak tried to comfort Rudd, noting the professor's goodwill and philosophizing about the educational role of defeat. But the boy, still overcome with shame, sharply ordered him to be quiet. 3 days later, a large assembly was organized, at which all the students were asked to line up by class, creating an atmosphere of anticipation for an important event. After the assembly, Professor Winston announced the start of joint combat training sessions, causing a slight stir among the students. The start of the competition between classes A and B was announced, which immediately caught the attention of everyone present, who were looking forward to exciting battles. The rules were announced. Each student personally chooses an opponent for the competition in turn, and participants, who have already been chosen, cannot participate in other matches. The announcement that each student would fight twice sparked particular enthusiasm in Hennis, whose eyes lit up with anticipation of the upcoming battles. Concluding his explanation of the rules, the instructor wished the students victory. But amid the general excitement, only the protagonist, Rudd, remained outwardly indifferent, showing no visible reaction to what was happening. During the competition, all the instructors took their places on the second floor, closely evaluating the students' skills and abilities, starting with Jelly and McDowell. Although the event was formally called a competition, in essence, it was an evaluation exam disguised as a regular class. The primary evaluation criteria were solely the students' skills and talents, without any consideration of their background, connections, or past achievements and failures. Hennis noted that everyone present in Iradium was used to hearing about their exceptionality and genius, though Rudd couldn't recall anything like that from his past life. When the host loudly announced Hennis Hafley as number 8, the girl felt a surge of confidence and stepped forward. As she left the formation, Hennis confidently declared that, in the face of a genius like herself, her opponents were simply frozen in fear and awe. Balak, unable to contain his emotions, loudly supported his friend, calling her a true genius, which slightly annoyed the girl with his excessive and inappropriate enthusiasm. Rudd, watching the scene unfold, was surprised by her choice, noting to himself that only she could choose a swordsman, being a mage weak in close combat. At the command, "Begin!" both opponents assumed fighting stances, preparing for the duel. Without wasting a second, Hennis conjured bright fireballs, demonstrating her impressive mastery of fire magic. Without the slightest hesitation, the girl directed her magical attack at her opponent, hoping to catch him off guard with her speed and power. The swordsman, well prepared for possible magical attacks, successfully and in time, shielded himself with a sturdy shield from Hennis's not-too-fast but dangerous fireball. The girl's opponent was inwardly glad that the attack's speed wasn't that high, realizing that otherwise, the fight could have ended unexpectedly after the very first strike. The swordsman, quickly recovering from the first attack, attempted a counterattack, swinging his deadly weapon with determination. His opponent deftly dodged the blow and instantly began casting a new spell, once again surprising the young man with her speed. The swordsman desperately tried to fend off Hennis's multiple fire attacks, gradually losing the initiative and feeling the mounting pressure from her. The distance between the students increased, giving Halfley the opportunity to prepare an even more powerful magic spell. Just as her opponent decided he needed to close the distance immediately, the student suddenly appeared right beside him, deftly pressing a sharp dagger against his unguarded neck. Realizing his defeat, the young man honestly admitted defeat, and the professor immediately declared Hennis Halfley the deserved winner. The girl looked up joyfully, hearing praise from the teachers who had been watching the fight. Hennis's intense gaze was directed for a reason. She was seeking the approval of Miss Liana, her idol, who was among the distinguished spectators in the upper rows. Liana Chernica, known as the Empress of the White Flame, was the celebrated leader of a prestigious guild and an idol to Hennis. Donatos, concerned by his friend's risky tactics, asked what she was thinking, rushing so recklessly toward the swordsman at such a dangerously close range. Hennis, smiling, explained her strategy. She was counting on the element of complete surprise, assuming that an inexperienced opponent would never expect a mage to engage in close combat. Rudd noted to himself how risky such a strategy was, recalling that Hennis had always been known for her unconventional approach to magical duels. The professors watching from above acknowledged that Hennis truly had an excellent sense of her opponent's slightest movements and acted with surprising skill and efficiency. Ms. Clare remarked admiringly on Hennis's correct use of magic and her keen assessment of the situation. Arthur Winston emphasized how rare it was to find such gifted, combat-oriented mages, and suggested bringing in additional instructors for fire magic. When the next participant was announced, Claire waited with undisguised interest to see who else would enter the arena for the duel. William Fart, before even reaching the center of the arena, challenged Rudd Donatos to a duel, seeking long-awaited revenge for a humiliating past defeat. The homeroom teacher of Class A was delighted by this turn of events, eagerly hoping to see her talented favorite once again spectacularly put the arrogant William in his place. Listening to all this, Rudd was inwardly baffled by the excessive grandstanding and unnecessary theatrics, viewing it as a sign of weakness and insecurity. Deciding to accept the challenge and teach him a lesson, Donatos headed for the stage, mentally preparing for the upcoming duel. The protagonist, demonstratively warming up his hands before the fight, decided to give it his all to teach the self-assured and annoying opponent a lesson he'd never forget. The intrigued students watched the start of the fight closely, but suddenly heard William's screams, which caused general astonishment. Fart's desperate cries of surrender rang out from the stage, instantly turning the expressions of the watching students to fear. Rudd, watching William being carried away on a stretcher in disgrace, remarked ironically on his tenacity despite his swift defeat. The professor praised the participants and asked if Rudd Donatos was ready to continue or needed a rest, suggesting they change the order of the matches. The young man firmly declared his intention to continue the battle and was given permission to name his next opponent. To everyone's surprise, Rudd challenged his friend Balak Steros, recognized as one of the strongest and most dangerous students at the academy. Balak was so shocked by the choice that, in his confusion, he could barely utter a word in response. Despite his obvious reluctance to fight a friend, the bewildered Steros nevertheless entered the arena, continuing to express his categorical disagreement with the situation. Rudd, ignoring his friend's doubts, insisted on the duel, arguing that Balak was the strongest of those present. Steros, frowning, declared his fundamental unwillingness to fight his friends, to which Rudd, provoking him, immediately accused his comrade of cowardice. Lost in thought, the young man recalled Balak's incredible strength in his past life, when the ground beneath his feet literally trembled from his powerful strides. In those vivid memories, he possessed such phenomenal, almost mythical power that mountains crumbled at the mere swing of his fists. Realizing that his current strength was insufficient to achieve his great goal, Rudd decided to insult Balak's honor in order to reach a new level of mastery. Balak, yielding to the provocation, reluctantly accepted the challenge, declaring that the fighter Steros does not back down from a fight. Rudd, satisfied that he had achieved his goal, accepted Balak's decision with a smile. Steros, preparing for the inevitable clash, sincerely expressed his hope for a fair fight at full strength, openly acknowledging Rudd's current combat superiority over him. The protagonist noted with a sneer that such words were unnecessary as he prepared for the serious duel. Following the rules, the opponents took their positions on opposite sides of the stage, eagerly awaiting the referee's long-awaited command to begin the fight. Both students were extremely serious, watching each other closely and analyzing every movement, until the referee gave the command, "Begin!" Hearing the long-awaited command, Rudd and Balak began to slowly close in on each other, preparing for their first clash. During an intense training session in the main character's gym, someone suddenly called out to him, distracting him from his workout. It turned out to be the mighty Steros, who had come at the urgent request of Rudd's older brother to rein in his wild behavior. The young man, scowling angrily, ordered him to tell his brother to come in person if he had any complaints, and turned away. But his interlocutor reproached him for being rude to his family. At Balak's unexpected reply, Rudd's sword slipped from his hands, revealing his shock at what he had heard. Enraged, Rudd fiercely ordered the boar to shut up and was outraged by the mention of family. Steros objected that he wasn't a boar and asked the brother why he was confronting him, stepping closer to the young man. The protagonist, completely losing his temper, grabbed Balak by the shirt and asked menacingly if he wanted to die by meddling in his affairs. The protagonist, provoking Balak, goaded him to attack, using offensive language. The cocky young man couldn't have imagined that he would soon find himself defeated, sprawled on the floor. Lying on the floor, Rudd, wincing in pain, acknowledged his opponent's incredible strength, calling him a damn boar. The fighter raised his sword and held it out to the hero, acknowledging his strength despite his obvious superiority in this battle, which infuriated the hero, who suspected mockery. After the incidents with Lion and William, Rudd was forced to admit that his skill level was insufficient to compete with the true talents of the Iradium Academy. Balak demonstrated incredible strength, splitting the arena floor with a sharp kick and drawing the spectators' admiration with his power. Without wasting a moment, Steros rushed toward his opponent with a battle cry, preparing to deliver a crushing blow. Rudd did not wait passively. He braced himself, extending his arm forward to counter the approaching opponent. When Balak was within range, Donatos delivered a powerful low blow to his chin, attempting to halt his rapid advance. Despite the force of the blow, it only slightly slowed the determined fighter, failing to throw him off balance or halt his attack. Balak, displaying his polished technique, skillfully defended against Rudd's subsequent attacks, blocking his shots. Steros didn't limit himself to defense. He also attacked with full force, trying to find a weak spot and break through his opponent's defense. Despite Balak's impressive power, Rudd's agility allowed him to land an unexpected and painful elbow strike to his opponent's stomach. But even such a powerful blow couldn't knock the tenacious Steros off his feet. Burning with a thirst for revenge, he continued to attack relentlessly. Rudd's next powerful blow sent his tenacious opponent flying several meters backward, demonstrating the protagonist's superiority. Approaching his defeated opponent, Donatos mockingly noted Balak's recklessness in his open attacks, calling him a crazy hunk of muscle. Lying on the ground, Balak was bewildered, realizing that despite several successful hits, not a single scratch was visible on Donatos. Rudd noted to himself that a wrestler's soul was contained within his muscles, recalling the Steros clan, northern wrestlers obsessed with building muscle. Years of training had turned the Steros' bodies into living armor, capable of replacing both spear and shield in brutal combat. Realizing the ineffectiveness of conventional strikes, Balak began frantically devising a new strategy right in the middle of the fight. Steros marveled at his opponent's incredible speed, trying to keep up with Ruda's lightning-fast movements and find his weak spot. Balak realized that to defeat his skilled opponent, he would need to rely not only on speed, but also on complex, unpredictable techniques. Without a moment's hesitation, Steros let out a loud battle cry and tensed his muscles so hard that his shirt couldn't withstand the strain and ripped. Confident in his invulnerability, Balak rushed into battle, believing that his muscular armor was impossible to pierce. However, Steros was soon surprised to feel a sharp pain from a precise strike by his incredibly skilled opponent. Rudd advised his opponent to dodge, preparing to deliver another crushing blow. Balak exhaled angrily through clenched teeth, trying to gather his strength and find a way to counter the invincible technique of his friend, who had suddenly become his enemy. The protagonist realized that true victory required not a powerful strike, but a special technique of gentle pressure. Therefore, he decided to use a method capable of piercing Balak's muscular armor and striking his internal organs. Donatos realized that if Steros didn't dodge the next attack, he would inevitably lose the fight. Rudd employed a secret technique of the Steros clan, combining the firmness of mountains with the flexibility of ocean waves. Balak recognized his family's technique in Rudd's movements, but never imagined that his friend had also mastered the counter techniques. The fighter was puzzled as to how a friend who did not belong to their clan had managed to master these skills, but decided that it didn't matter right now, looking at the young man in front of him. At that moment, Balak was focused on only one thing: winning at all costs against his self-assured opponent. The protagonist, swinging his arm, loudly warned his opponent of his attack. Blocking the blow, Balak clearly understood that he needed to concentrate and closely watch his opponent's movements. Steros was confident that he could discern a pattern in Rudd's attacks and easily predict the trajectory of his strikes. The enraged Balak's main goal was to grab his agile opponent at any cost and use his strength advantage. The fighter thrust his arm forward with a tightly clenched fist, trying to land a straight punch on Rudd. Donatos, anticipating the attack, responded with a counterpunch, and the fighter's fists collided in the air with a loud thud. Rudd mentally noted the undeniable genius of his worthy opponent, who had managed to unerringly anticipate his actions at the last moment. The protagonist realized that Balak's strength lay not only in his impressive physical attributes, but also in his ability to sense his opponent. However, Donatos looked exhausted, clearly lagging behind Steros in remaining energy reserves. Balak, determined not to let such a rare opportunity slip away and seizing the moment, went on the offensive. With a loud battle cry as if unleashing all his fury, Steros charged forward, preparing to deliver what he hoped would be the winning blow. Rudd did not dodge the attack, which immediately put Balak on guard, making him suspect something was amiss. With a barely perceptible sly smile, Donatos remarked that it had been a good fight and that Steros was indeed strong, making his friend even more wary. At that very moment, the protagonist drew a gleaming sword from its sheath and began to swing it. It all happened so quickly that the fighter didn't have time to react to the unexpected attack, and his hand, raised to strike, ended up in the path of the sword. Rudd managed to catch Balak's shirt with his sword and cut it slightly, causing him to lose his balance and plop down on his backside. Looking down at his opponent sitting on the floor, the hero smugly declared his superiority and strength. The students watching the fight burst into enthusiastic cheers, admiring the spectacle before them. The professor, clearly dissatisfied with something, shouted that this couldn't be happening as she watched the victor help the defeated man to his feet. Professor Winston asked in bewilderment, was this really a student battle? Even though they didn't use mana, their skill level clearly surpassed what's typical for dragon slayers. Mrs. Clare was amazed by the precision of the movements and the perfection of the technique, noting that Rudd was already ready for high-level combat. Professor Daniel echoed his colleague's thoughts, noting that the final sword strike that ended the duel was particularly impressive. The instructors were astonished to notice that Rudd's moves resembled the teacher's legendary technique. They recognized elements of Ina Bryce's famous heavenly sword in the young man's movements. No matter how much of a genius she was, it seemed impossible to defeat this demon. But Aina turned out to be not just a genius, but a true sword monster. The professors, fired up by the idea of personally training such a gifted student, noted that Aina possessed a fully developed technique, even before she began her training. As lunchtime approached, the students, feeling hungry, headed together to the spacious dining hall. Hennies, banging her fists on the table, expressed her dissatisfaction with yet another Korean meal, stating that on a day like this, they could have gone to a restaurant for lunch. Balak objected that restaurants often serve low-protein meals, and Rudd complained about the lack of funds, which annoyed his classmate even more. The guy, spearing a piece of food with his fork, wondered why they should pay when they could eat for free, and asked if Hafley really had no money to her name. She gave him a piercing look and replied firmly that she had more than enough money. The guy, chewing on another bite of food, remembered that in the past, the girl had come from a very wealthy and respected family. The young man, glancing at Steros sitting next to him, tried to recall that this dimwit, too, had apparently never known want or hardship. Rudd, watching the wrestler greedily shovel food into his mouth with his hands and sit there covered in food, concluded that even though he was an aristocrat, he behaved like a wild primate. Realizing that he was the only pauper who had risked his life and worked as a mercenary for financial reasons, the guy got angry at this truth and sped up his eating. A classmate condescendingly remarked that, in principle, she could treat him, since Balak surely had money, which meant that Denatos was the only poor one here. The protagonist, shouting that he didn't need the pitiful handouts of spoiled rich people, thrust his fork forward as if threatening the girl sitting across from him. From the side came the exclamation, "There he is! That very student!" And the surprised friends turned in unison at the unexpected outburst. One of the approaching young men looked questioningly at his companion, Abel, and asked if this was the student he had been talking about so enthusiastically just a moment ago. The other intrigued students in the background were discussing whether these were the leaders of the famous guilds, the Pursuer and the Dull Moon. Introducing himself as Roderick Riddle, the head of the Pursuer Guild greeted the protagonist, noting his impressive battle. Rudd, without even bothering to rise from his seat, replied tersely that his name was Rudd Donatos, and looked at the guests expectantly. In the ensuing conversation, the illustrious names of the legendary Sky Archer Roderick and the enigmatic Moon Shadow Abel were mentioned more than once. The protagonist recalled that in his past life, he had never had the chance to meet them in person, as they had fallen in battle against a celestial dragon before he became a monster slayer. Roderick jokingly described his taciturn companion, Abel White, as a shy young man, at which the latter demonstratively rolled his eyes and protested. The leader of the renowned Pursuer Guild laughed heartily and dismissed his words as nothing more than a harmless joke. Hennis, nervous and stuttering slightly, barely managed to say her name as she awkwardly rose from the table. Balak also introduced himself, politely suggesting they get to know each other better. The girl, grabbing Steris by the hair, accused him of speaking too familiarly with these respected people, to which Riddler remarked with a laugh that they too seemed quite capable to him. Halfley, burning with curiosity, politely asked what exactly the leaders of powerful guilds were doing in a modest school cafeteria. The leader of the Pursuers Guild tried to joke that they too had graduated from that academy and were simply missing Korean food, to which Hennis asked if Miss Liana had come with them. Upon learning that Chernica had left immediately after the battle, saying there was nothing left to see, the girl said sadly, "I see," and dropped her head in disappointment. Roderick, trying to cheer the student up, smiled and told her that the leader of Holy Fire would be returning to the walls of his native Iradium very soon. The leader of the Pursuer Guild, stepping closer to the protagonist, noted that Aval had praised him highly, saying that such talent was essential to their organization. Aval irritably asked Roderick to stop spouting nonsense and, turning to the student, asked if he knew who he was. Without batting an eye, Rudd replied that his interlocutor was an outstanding dragon slayer, ranked 4th, and the leader of the second-ranked guild, Dull Moon. Aval confirmed the young man's knowledge, but emphasized that Dull Moon ranked 2nd, not because it was inferior to Sacred Fire. The student briefly agreed, whereupon White, getting straight to the point, noted that he had seen his fight and considered his skill level to be quite good. The young man, confidently affirming his outstanding strength, once again provoked his classmates' anger with his behavior in front of respected figures. White, impressed by the young man's self-confidence, made a tempting offer to join the prestigious Dull Moon Guild immediately after completing his studies at the academy. Stunned by this turn of events, the girl jumped up abruptly, making no attempt to hide her astonishment at what she had heard. The protagonist, trying to hide his surprise, asked why he had been chosen specifically and inquired about the ban on early recruitment of students. The guild representative explained that special exceptions are made for exceptionally talented students, guaranteeing them the best conditions to realize their potential. The young man, citing uncertainty about the choice, reflected that such an offer would provide a secure foundation but limit his freedom of future action, and decided to propose a deal, surprising the leader of the Dull Moon. He asked them to track down his older brother, who had managed to survive the devastating celestial cataclysm that had occurred a decade ago. White, assessing the difficulty of the task, asked what exactly the hero was willing to offer in exchange for such a challenging assignment. The young man's response that he would provide personal connections triggered an unexpected fit of hysterical laughter from Roderick, who had been observing the conversation. The guildmaster, after some thought, agreed to the terms, counting on a mutually beneficial relationship with a potential rising star of the magical world. Donatos, maintaining an air of mystery, laconically confirmed his intentions regarding future cooperation. After finishing their conversation, the guests headed for the exit, just as a red-haired girl, watching their receding figures, compared what had happened to a hurricane and wondered if all rankers were like that. Halfley, holding a small envelope in her hands, asked her friend who had declined the offer if he was confident in his abilities and had received good results in the notification. The protagonist remembered the letter with the teacher's grades, which he had completely forgotten about due to the unexpected encounter. He recalled that in past lives, after the competitions ended, students were given evaluation sheets, but he didn't remember if he had received decent results. The protagonist, opening the envelope with undisguised excitement, admitted to his friends that he had indeed received exactly the same envelope with the results as they had. Hennis, unable to hide her optimism, suggested that the feedback would be overwhelmingly positive, something the whole family would undoubtedly be proud of. Rudd, observing his classmates' intense gaze, wondered if the story about his brother was troubling her, remembering that she had a sister who was in a coma. Balak, wanting to ease the tension, asked Rudd with genuine interest what kind of person his brother was. The young man paused for a moment, then briefly and unexpectedly described his brother as an incredibly kind but utterly brainless idiot, surprising his companions. Donatos noted that his brother had indeed been a fool who had decided to become an indomitable warrior to save his only younger brother, but had ultimately perished because of him, though he did not say this out loud. Overcoming his inner resistance, Donatos acknowledged aloud his brother's incredible strength, which he could not even dream of matching. Steros, hearing such high praise, confidently surmised that such an outstanding warrior must surely be alive, despite all the trials. The protagonist, hiding his deep sorrow, merely whispered words of hope, unwilling to reveal his true feelings. Noticing the general gloom, the red-haired girl decided to lighten the mood and suggested they start by checking their grades. Overcome with curiosity, everyone present opened their envelopes at the same time, pulling out the long-awaited notices. The first student proudly read aloud a glowing evaluation confirming her potential to become an outstanding battle mage. Balak, making no attempt to hide his surprise, read about his excellent physical attributes, noting an unusual compliment regarding his muscles. Donatos asked about the strange wording at the end, calling the instructors ridiculous for such evaluations, to which Steros remarked with a smile that Professor Clare was a good person. While Hennis was indignant at the absurdity of the comment and the wrestler was proud of the recognition of his muscles, the young man cautiously pulled out his notice. Finally, his classmate fell silent, looked at her flustered classmate, and asked why he wasn't reading. Irritated by the prolonged silence, she snatched the piece of paper from the young man's hands, demanding that he show her the contents immediately. The girl looked at the notice in surprise and asked, bewildered, what it said. The grade sheet was covered with a multitude of different signatures, which was extremely unusual and surprising. Her curiosity grew, and the young man, wasting no time, headed decisively to the faculty office to clarify the situation. Upon entering the spacious office, the young man saw 4 respected professors and, apologizing sheepishly for the disturbance, waited anxiously for their reaction. The stern homeroom teacher of Class D, furrowing his thick eyebrows, rudely commented on the talented student's sudden appearance, suddenly changing his tone to one that was surprisingly friendly. The same experienced mentor warmly invited the bewildered young man to take a seat. Rudd, remaining vigilant, cautiously accepted the offer, intuitively sensing the unusual and strange nature of the atmosphere that had developed. Caring Mrs. Clare, wishing to create a cozy atmosphere, inquired with motherly warmth about the gifted student's preferences for coffee and cookies. No sooner had she finished her sentence than Professor Daniel, noticing the chill in the room, thoughtfully suggested that the young man put on a warm jacket. Sharply sensing the teacher's obvious attempts to win him over, the quick-witted young man involuntarily turned his keen attention to the mysteriously silent Damien. Deciding to clarify the situation, the protagonist openly asked if he was correct in assuming that this was related to the selection of an advisor. Winston confirmed his guess, noting Rudd's awareness of the significance of the signatures on the evaluation sheet. Patiently and in detail, he explained the procedure for first-year students to select a mentor and the unique opportunity for interested faculty members to interact directly with promising students. The enigmatic Damien Grace, breaking the silence, particularly emphasized the exceptional rarity and significance of obtaining the coveted autographs of all the Academy's professors. Ms. Clare, radiating kindness, enthusiastically praised Ruda for his impressive achievements in various magical fields, encouraging him not to be shy when choosing his future mentor. The teachers present were introduced by their legendary nicknames: the unrivaled White Sword, Daniel Gould, and the indomitable Mad Dog, Claire Mason. Rounding out this outstanding quartet were the mysterious Phantom Predator, Damien Grace, and the mighty Thunderspear, Arthur Winston, each a master of their craft. Lost in his memories, Rudd suddenly realized that in his past life, Daniel had been his mentor, and that he would surely help him grasp the secrets of swordsmanship. Summoning his courage, Donatos resolutely expressed his sincere desire to learn the complex art of fencing from the renowned master of the blade. Delighted, Professor Daniel enthusiastically approved the talented student's choice, while the other instructors visibly grew somber, making no attempt to hide their disappointment. To everyone's surprise, the student put forward a bold condition to become Daniel's personal student, causing shocking astonishment among the teachers present. Stunned, Professor Gould, trying to hide his agitation, asked the young man if he fully understood the gravity and responsibility of his proposal. Confident in his knowledge, Rudd inquired about the vacant position of successor to the legendary Sky Warrior, demonstrating his awareness. A Sky Warrior is an unrivaled master of the sword, a virtuoso of mana control, specially trained for the most difficult mission of dragon slaying. In a past life, Professor Daniel had trained the hero's brother, the legendary Sky Warrior, whose worthy successor the young Rude was originally meant to become. Surprised by the young man's unexpected knowledge, the mentor inquired about the source of his information regarding the vacant position. The professor, who had been secretly pondering his future student, was taken aback by Rudd's initiative, which had preempted his plans. Intrigued by this unusual turn of events, Daniel delicately inquired about the motives of the young man who wished to take on such a responsible position. Rudd, gathering his courage, sincerely confessed his weakness and his desire to gain the strength to protect his loved ones from the dragons that had destroyed his family. The student's words plunged Daniel into painful memories of his own childhood. As he reflected on the possibility of protecting his loved ones, a vivid image appeared before the professor's eyes. A little boy and his older sister fleeing from danger, running with all their might, holding hands tightly. Suddenly, the little legs couldn't keep up with the rapid pace. The child stumbled, letting go of his sister's hand, and fell helplessly to the ground. That fateful moment led to the death of his beloved sister. A merciless dragon caught up with her, leaving her no chance of escape. Daniel realized, no matter what suffering a person has endured, one who craves power solely out of a desire for revenge is unworthy of becoming a celestial warrior. With a sudden change in his tone, the professor surprised his colleagues by declaring that the true goal of protecting others was worthy of respect and support. Turning to Rudd, Daniel offered not only to become his mentor, but also to enlist the other professors in teaching the talented young man. Stunned by the unexpected proposal, the protagonist couldn't help but let out a loud cry of astonishment. Daniel, trying to explain his position to his colleagues, emphasized the uniqueness of the boys' abilities and the importance of their comprehensive development. Realizing the scope of the proposal, the protagonist tried to object, pointing out the difficulty of training, even with a single mentor, and the potential imbalance. And here, there would be as many as 4. Unexpectedly, Winston supported the idea, declaring the need to train the perfect dragon slayer for the sake of saving the world. The protagonist, surprised by the abrupt change in Professor Arthur's stance, a man known for his adherence to the rules, noticed a clear contradiction in his words. The homeroom teacher for Class D cynically remarked that discontent was inevitable, but that the other students had only themselves to blame for their own inadequacies. Professor Claire, enthusiastically supporting the idea, raised her hand, and the usually silent Damien followed suit. Daniel, placing a reassuring hand on the confused student's shoulder, assured him that he would respect any decision, emphasizing the preliminary nature of the proposal. Rudd, lost in thought, weighed the pros and cons, aware of the responsibility of the choice and its impact on the future. Summoning his courage, the young man turned to the professors, who were listening intently, asking for their support and help in achieving his goal. He expressed his determination to change the future by restoring hope to those who had lost it, even if it meant transcending his former self. Concluding his speech, Rudd firmly declared his intention to become stronger and take on the role of a warrior capable of withstanding the coming calamities. Lion Claire, battered and exhausted, wandered down the hallway, silently cursing the cruel professor for the grueling training. 2 hours earlier, on the training field, Professor Claire had announced an extra lesson, which turned out to be independent training for the student. The girl, stunned by the unexpected turn of events, asked in disbelief about the independent training. The teacher, maintaining a smile, suggested that the student assume a fighting stance, hinting at the trials ahead. Her expression suddenly changing, Claire attacked the student with a battle cry, leaving her no chance to prepare. Now, barely able to move down the hallway and clutching her injured side, Lion felt every blow she received. Anger at Ruta, who had supposedly complained after a single blow, overwhelmed the girl, causing her to kick the vase of flowers in a fit of rage. Sitting down on the steps, Lion reflected on the unfairness of the punishment, acknowledging partial blame for the misunderstanding with Donatos. Realizing that the extra lesson was just an excuse. The girl, unable to hold back her emotions, struck her knees, tears streaming down her face. The protagonist, noticing the student crying on the steps, hurriedly hid behind a wall, unable to believe his eyes. Rudd, struck by the unexpected sight, reflected on the usually cool-headed lion Claire, whose tears seemed an incredible phenomenon for such a reserved person. The young man recalled that he had only witnessed such an outpouring of emotion from the girl after the tragic death of the leader of the Dead Dragon Guild. In her past life, Lion had been an ordinary child until the death of her adoptive father, the guild leader, which turned the 17-year-old girl into a true demon, cold and ruthless. Ironically, the man for whom Lion was now weeping was hiding nearby behind a wall, Rude Donatos himself, the unwitting cause of her suffering. Tormented by guilt, Rudd whispered quietly that he hadn't complained to anyone or spread rumors, peeking cautiously from behind his cover. Feeling his conscience gnawing at him, the young man involuntarily clutched his neck, realizing his part in the girl's suffering. Unable to stand by any longer, Rudd resolutely made his way toward the weeping lion, bracing himself for a difficult conversation. The girl's reaction turned out to be unexpectedly aggressive. She unleashed a torrent of accusations at the boy, blaming him for her complaints and the troubles he had caused her. While Lion continued her angry tirade, Rude, showing unexpected compassion, handed her a handkerchief and quietly uttered a sincere, "I'm sorry," catching the girl off guard. Stunned by the unexpected apology, Claire stumbled over her words, incredulously asking him to repeat what she had heard. Rudd, turning away and clutching his neck again in embarrassment, repeated his apology, admitting that he had indeed gone too far in their past conflict. Explaining the situation, the hero said that he hadn't started the rumors. Rather, his girlfriend had told the professor everything, leaving Lion with mixed feelings of surprise and disbelief. The girl, trying to hide her confusion, blew her nose forcefully into the offered handkerchief, causing Rudd to be slightly taken aback by such spontaneity. Lion, still trying to maintain her hostility, asked if Rudd really thought a simple apology would make her stop being angry. The young man, slightly flustered, remarked that he hadn't expected the handkerchief to be used that way, to which the girl assured him she would wash it, urging him to calm down. Finally softening, the swordswoman reluctantly accepted the apology, acknowledging her own partial fault, but warned of the consequences of further conflicts as she stuffed the handkerchief into her pocket. Rudd, agreeing to avoid conflict, demonstratively scratched his ear, feigning indifference, but mentally noted that Lion would become strong anyway, even without his help, just as she had in her past life. As she left, Claire unexpectedly remarked that she actually didn't mind if Rudd greeted her, which greatly surprised the young man. Stunned by such a sudden change of mood, the young man asked her to repeat herself, not believing his ears. Clearly annoyed at having to repeat herself, the girl turned around and reiterated her unexpected permission. The young man, puzzled by this unexpected display of friendliness, froze for a moment in thought. Suddenly, a slight smile involuntarily lit up his face, as he fully realized the unusual nature of her current behavior. Walking down the hallway, Lion mused aloud about her unexpected action, acknowledging that she wouldn't make any friends if she didn't change her usual behavior. A familiar voice suddenly rang out behind her, startling the girl, who had been deep in thought. Noticing that Rudd was following her, Lion asked why, to which the young man replied that he was also heading that way. The young man explained in detail that he was heading to Special Training Field A, designated for instructors' sessions. Surprised by the coincidence, the student said she was also heading to the same training field. The girl began to speculate about the similarity between their advisors, but stopped short when she noticed a sudden change in her companion's expression. The protagonist, his expression unchanged, decisively threw open the door and peered inside the training room. Professor Daniel, who had been waiting for them, asked if the students had come to class together. The protagonist asked in bewilderment if Lion would be attending the class with him, and received an affirmative answer. The young man was shocked, recalling that in his past life, the girl's advisor had been a completely different teacher, namely Professor Claire. When Lion bluntly asked if he was unhappy, Rudd irritably replied in the negative, trying to hide his confusion. As the young man tried to explain the benefits of studying close combat techniques for those who wield a one-handed sword, Claire unexpectedly demonstrated a deep understanding of her fighting style. Realizing his mistake, the young man tried to justify himself with observations made during competitions, suggesting that strength training be added to sword technique. Professor Daniel confirmed Rudd's words about the benefits of close combat for filling the gaps between an opponent's sword strikes. Lion, though displeased with Rudd's observations, acknowledged that the idea wasn't bad, while the young man tried to justify himself, accidentally letting out a curse. Surprised, Lion noted Rudd's curse, which had slipped from the hero's lips right in front of the instructor, while Daniel merely laughed at the situation. With a sly smirk, Lion threatened Rudd with swift punishment if he dared to get distracted during training. The hero mentally noted Claire's unusual behavior, wondering about her character in her past life. When Lion asked about his words, Rudd explained his surprise at her choice of Professor Daniel over Claire. Having learned that the girl hadn't received any signatures, Lion categorically rejected the idea of training with crazy Claire. Recalling a recent grueling session, Rudd realized that the future had changed again. In the past, Lion had a good relationship with Professor Claire, but now they were practically enemies. He realized that the cause of the changes was Professor Daniel's mysterious plan. Deep in thought, Donatos realized that he himself was the main reason behind this plan. Professor Daniel, interrupting the students' thoughts, began to explain the basics of sword technique, emphasizing the importance of diligent training. He noted the high skill level of both students, emphasizing the need for practical experience to develop an individual style. Concluding his explanation, Daniel emphasized the importance of appropriate training to gain the necessary experience. The mention of independent training elicited a strange reaction from the professor, causing him to smile ominously. Ignoring the students' shock and displeasure at the prospect of fighting each other, the professor asked if they were ready to begin the lesson. Daniel Gould announced the end of the lesson, addressing the completely exhausted students, who lay helplessly sprawled on the floor from fatigue. The instructor cheerfully said goodbye, announcing a future rotation of individual and group sessions, and wished the students a well-deserved weekend. Rudd, continuing to lie motionless, blamed it all on his weak defense with annoyance, while Lion slowly and with difficulty got to her feet, and the satisfied instructor left the training room. The observant girl sternly reminded her classmate of the need to watch his language after hearing yet another of his obscene curses. Donatos replied sarcastically that working as a mercenary would quickly teach her to swear, and asked with curiosity about her true feelings after the defeat. To everyone's surprise, Lion reacted to her loss with calm and philosophical composure, wisely noting that they had come here specifically to learn, while the exhausted Rudd continued to lie there apathetically. The swordswoman suggested trying training with Professor Claire, hinting at her legendary strictness, which unexpectedly put the protagonist on guard. Rudd hastily tried to change the subject, which was unpleasant for him, by demonstratively closing his eyes, but Lion suspected something and persistently continued her questioning. When the young man tried to leave, the girl demanded that he teach her his secret techniques as an apology, eliciting a sly smile from Donatos. The bewildered protagonist reacted with confusion to the girl's sudden request, genuinely surprised by her enthusiasm and determination. Lion persistently reminded Ruda of his earlier comments about her lack of combat skills, demanding that he teach her hand-to-hand combat techniques. Donatos tried to refuse, suggesting that the girl seek out an instructor, but Claire explained that she didn't have time to learn sword techniques. Unable to take it anymore, Lion, sitting at the young man's feet, began acting like a spoiled child, tugging at his pants and begging for help. The girl looked up at the protagonist, casting a pitiful glance at him, reminiscent of a pleading kitten. Rudd, unable to withstand the pressure, gave in and agreed to help, asking Lion to let go of his clothes and stop manipulating him. Claire exclaimed joyfully, reminding Donatos of his promise as he tried to hastily leave the room. The protagonist reflected on his inability to refuse the girl, noting the striking differences from his past life. Rudd tried to justify his decision with strategic considerations, involuntarily recalling Lion's sweet face and her potentially important role in future events. The young man viewed the situation as a chance to repay a debt from his past life, coming up with a convincing excuse for himself. Donatos decided to turn the training into a grueling ordeal, so that Lion would regret her request to teach her the techniques. The Iradium Academy, located in the capital of the Althea Empire, had traditionally been the main training ground for the strongest and most invincible dragon slayers in the entire country. The Imperial Palace generously provided comprehensive support to the prestigious academy, as most of its talented graduates went on to work successfully in the Empire's elite guilds. Virtually, despite the excellent conditions, many students were dissatisfied with the limited space within the academy's walls, so the administration allowed students to go into the city on weekends or holidays. The energetic Hennis, laden with a stack of books, impatiently hurried her friends along, loudly reminding them of the many things planned for the day. Sleepy Rudd dreamily spoke of his desire to sleep in, while exhausted Balak supported the idea of resting to recover his tired muscles. Enthusiastic Halfley was surprised by her friends' reluctance to explore the city, scolding them for planning to sleep through the entire weekend during their 4 years at the academy. Trying to cheer up her grumbling companions, The girl promised to treat them to an expensive and delicious lunch after a walk around the city. Rudd, upon hearing about the expensive treat, sarcastically remarked that it was worth putting up with the inconvenience for something like that, making Hennis smile. Balak, noticing his friend's discontent, innocently asked if Hennis had specifically asked Rudd to carry her things, hinting at the possibility of refusing. The protagonist slyly discovered that Steros had no money on him, and deftly shifted the responsibility of carrying the purchases onto his friend, while their friend ran off in search of new items. Exhausted, Balak, lugging Halfley's numerous purchases, muttered sadly about the psychology of the poor, while the energetic girl, running ahead, hurried the slow-moving guys along. After a long shopping spree, during which Hennis bought a huge amount of things, she decided it was time for the promised lavish dinner. The group entered an expensive restaurant, where the attentive waiters respectfully greeted Miss Hennis Halfley, bowing low to her. Rudu felt awkward in such a posh establishment, especially when the well-trained waiters politely escorted them to the best table. Struck by watching his friend's confident demeanor, the young man wondered if they were trying to demonstrate their high status in this way. The girl ordered identical meal sets for all three of them, adding a hefty 600-gram venison steak for Balak at his request. The insatiable wrestler continued to study the menu, explaining the need to replenish his lost energy, which annoyed Hennis, who urged him to know his limits. Donatos was shocked by the price of a single-set meal at 500 million rubles, noting that it was the cost of his monthly food budget. Embarrassed and stunned by the prices, Rudd cautiously asked Hennis if their meal at this luxurious restaurant would be too expensive. The generous Halfley confidently declared that, since her friends had helped her with her shopping, she was obliged to treat them properly, offering him the chance to order additional dishes as he pleased. Delighted, Balak tried to take advantage of the offer, but Hennis cut him off sharply, reminding him of the portion of meat that had already been ordered. Steros tried to object, pointing out that he had also carried bags, but was rudely cut off by the irritated girl. The waiter brought a multitude of plates with exquisite dishes, stunning Rudd, who had never before seen such a lavish spread. Balak, having assessed the taste of the food, compared it to the cuisine of a family chef, but expressed dissatisfaction with the small portions, intending to order more. Annoyed by Steros' behavior, Hennis suddenly flung a table knife in his direction, demonstrating her displeasure. The girl sternly reminded Balak of her demand to be quiet, while the frightened wrestler stared at the knife stuck next to him. Instantly encouraged, Halfley began enthusiastically recommending various delicacies to Donatos that she had already tried. Rudd, unaccustomed to such fine cuisine, struggled to appreciate the taste of the exquisite dishes, trying to hide his confusion at the variety of delicacies. The protagonist noticed Hennis's excessive friendliness after their conversation about his brother, which caused him some tension and suspicion. Recalling his past life, Donatos noted that he and Halfley had never been close friends, and she could easily call him names and interrupt him while he was eating. In his memory, in the past, Donatos reflected that he would have been more used to seeing her rude but honest than watching her current fawning. When Rudd tried to speak to Hennis, she cut him off sharply, shifting her attention to Balak's latest antics. The girl angrily scolded Steros for trying to order more food, threatening to cut off his hand if he reached for the menu again. Hennis sarcastically suggested that all of Balak's food went to his muscles rather than his brain, or that his brain was made of muscle too, given the lack of convolutions. Despite his impressive physical strength, Balak showed a surprising fear of Hennis, especially when she was enraged. Caught off guard by the mood shift, Rudd awkwardly thanked her for the treat, forcing a smile and mentally convincing himself that this behavior was better than his previous rudeness. Halfley accepted the thanks with pride and joy, while Balak, sitting next to her, lowered his head, clearly upset by the discriminatory treatment. The clock read 8 o'clock. Hennis seemed not to understand the reasons for Steros' sadness, puzzled as to why he looked so downcast. Rudd didn't just glance at his watch. He suddenly remembered his promise to meet Lion at that time for training. Punctual Claire, remembering the arrangement perfectly well, was already waiting for Donatos in the training hall, gradually growing irritated by his tardiness. It had already been 5 minutes past the appointed time, but Rudd still hadn't shown up, which only increased Lion's anxiety. The girl thought sadly about how Rudd was the first person she'd been able to get along with at the academy, assuming that, unlike her, he surely had many friends, which might be why he'd forgotten about their meeting. However, her gloomy thoughts were interrupted when, at that very moment, the door to the training hall swung open, and he finally appeared in the doorway. Out of breath, Rudd approached Lion and casually asked how long she had been waiting, trying to hide his embarrassment at being late. The annoyed girl sharply scolded him for his lack of punctuality. reminding him of the rule to arrive 10 minutes before the appointed time. Donatos, trying to lighten the mood, apologized, scratching his head, but Claire demonstratively turned away, showing her offense. Lion, catching the scent of food, asked if Rudd had eaten before the meeting, to which he, trying to cover his tracks, explained his trip to the capital. Surprised that he had left the academy, the girl asked again, and the student, taking off his jacket, confirmed his trip. Donatos mentioned dinner with a friend, his whole demeanor showing his reluctance to delve into the details of the subject. Lion, lowering her head, said with barely concealed sadness that she understood, clearly upset by the news about Ruta's friends. Trying to change the subject, the young man began talking about training, but was interrupted by Claire's remark about his many friends. The young man tried to start by explaining a simple fighting stance, but Lion interrupted him again, mentioning that she had never been to the capital. Annoyed by the constant distractions from training, Donatos could barely contain himself when Claire once again started talking about her loneliness. Lion, finally realizing the inappropriateness of her comments, tried to get back to the topic of training, noticing the lack of reaction from the clearly annoyed Rudd. To the girl's surprise, Donatos headed down the stairs, announcing that the training session was postponed until next Saturday. Puzzled, Claire hurried after him, but Rudd, waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, unexpectedly suggested they take a trip to the capital together. The girl's face instantly lit up, and with barely concealed excitement, she asked if it was true. Noticing her joy, Rudd asked about it ironically, to which Lion, trying to hide her emotions, hesitantly agreed to the trip. Returning to the original purpose of the meeting, Donatos suggested they start warming up, reminding her of the students' desire to learn how to fight. The girl, excited about the upcoming trip, bombarded Rudd with questions about the sights and food in the capital. Claire continued to ask about his past visits and time spent with friends, causing the young man obvious confusion. Unable to withstand the barrage of questions, Rudd suddenly threw a glove in Lion's face, trying to cut off her endless chatter. Outraged by this, the girl got angry, but Donatos insisted on the need to focus on training. Rudd asked in surprise if Lion had always been so talkative, to which she mentioned her mother's jokes about her chattiness, and asked if he knew her mother, the leader of the Dead Dragon Guild. Donatos wondered how he had put up with such chattiness in his past life, while Claire continued to share information about herself. Unable to take it anymore, Rudd spun around abruptly and shouted at the girl, demanding she stop her endless chatter. The young man began to explain that in combat, he used a modified version of the Stero style, adapted for ordinary people, mentioning the clan's superhuman physical attributes. Donatos clarified that he could teach Lion only a few of his brother's moves and methods, without revealing all the secrets of the technique. He suggested combining these moves with Professor Claire's techniques to achieve the best results. Rudd explained that in real combat, there are no strict rules. The main thing is to dodge blows and land them on the opponent. Lion expressed doubt about the possibility of constantly dodging, especially when the opponent is hot on her heels. Donatos promised to teach her ways to minimize the blows she received and demonstrated a method of quick movement. Claire watched her companion's movements closely but couldn't quite follow them, comparing the technique to a writhing snake. Rudd explained the technique in detail, emphasizing movement on the balls of the feet and minimal use of the leg muscles to achieve barely perceptible shifts. Lion asked if this technique was also part of the Stero style. Surprised by its unusual nature, Donatos admitted that he had developed this move himself, noting that Claire usually doesn't use such techniques. Impressed, the girl asked if Rudd was truly a genius, since he had managed to create such a technique. Flattered by the compliment, the young man smiled and suggested that Lion try performing the movement on her own. Claire tentatively stood on her tiptoes, asking if she was doing it correctly, while her teacher watched her attempts closely. Watching Lion's first and successful attempt, Donatos wondered who really deserved to be called a genius. Rudd recalled that it had taken him 2 years to develop this technique, another year to adapt it, and a year to fully master it. He mentally noted that it was difficult to call someone a genius who was simply trying to survive by any means necessary, comparing his own efforts to Claire's rapid mastery of the technique. Donatos thought about his comrades from his past life, comparing their abilities and potential. Lion, eagerly awaiting praise, asked Rudd excitedly if she had performed the complex technique correctly, hoping for approval of her efforts. Rudd remained mysteriously silent, merely smiling slightly as he watched his students' uncertain movements closely. Waiting for the moment when the trusting girl approached, Donatos suddenly tripped her, harshly pointing out her terrible performance. Caught off guard, Claire fell loudly to the floor of the training hall and screamed in sudden pain. Rudd, assuming the role of a strict teacher, sternly reminded her of the need to move on her toes, rather than performing ridiculous dances. As she got up and rubbed her bruised head in irritation, the swordswoman cursed, railing against the cruel training methods, while Donatos mercilessly ordered her to try again. The unyielding Rudd firmly declared that he would mercilessly torment her with training until she achieved perfect execution of the technique. Screams and pleas from the exhausted lion to stop the leg sweeps echoed from the hall for a long time, while the sun slowly set outside. Finally reaching his room after the grueling training session, the completely exhausted Rudd sat down on the bed with relief. He wearily rested his aching arms beneath his throbbing head, sighing deeply and reflecting on the eventful day that had passed. Opening his eyes and staring at the ceiling, Donatos noted with satisfaction that, on the surface, everything was going smoothly, not much different from his previous life. However, the young man realized that his relationships with those around him had changed radically compared to his past experience, evoking mixed feelings. Rudd pondered the impact of these changes on the future, understanding the need to alter the course of events to save his friends from impending doom. The student decided that he needed to assemble a reliable team once again and destroy the celestial demon so that he could finally see his lost relative. For now, Rudd was coming to terms with his responsibility in fulfilling the difficult role of an older brother, preparing for the trials ahead. He determined that the first step toward achieving his goal was to master the mysterious blue sky technique, as indicated by the enigmatic snowflake. Sharp swords clanged loudly as they clashed fiercely against one another in combat. One of the skilled fighters was Professor Daniel, demonstrating superb mastery of the sword and combat techniques. His worthy opponent was the talented student Rude Donatos, displaying skills surprising for his age. The young man noted with surprise the serious professor's unexpected penchant for jokes during the fight. Realizing his unwillingness to lose, Daniel masterfully parried every one of Rudd's strikes, exuding confidence and demonstrating years of experience in this field. The experienced instructor executed complex maneuvers with virtuosity, sometimes closing in rapidly, other times suddenly pulling away from his opponent. In the heat of the battle, Gould had a sudden idea to change his fighting style to catch his student off guard. Rudd was stunned to see his teacher's fist suddenly appear before him, instead of the expected sword strike. Thanks to his natural talent, the young man reacted instantly, successfully blocking the unexpected attack. After parrying the blow, Donatos asked the professor in bewilderment whether it was indeed permitted to use weapons other than a sword in their duel. Daniel, chuckling, explained his action as a result of his highly unpredictable nature. Enjoying his student's confusion, Rudd noted to himself that he was still inferior to his teacher in physical conditioning, despite his extraordinary abilities. Gould watched his opponent with interest, wondering if the man was trying to lure him into a trap by retreating too far. The homeroom teacher decided to stop, giving the student a chance to demonstrate his full potential. "He's closing in fast," he said tensely, watching the determined student closely. The young man, after some thought, decided to stick to proven standard techniques and confidently executed a powerful blocking strike. His sharp sword immediately shot upward, as this was an integral part of the well-rehearsed technique. Not wanting to stop there prematurely, Donatos immediately applied a countering technique. The blue sky technique is a complex sword technique primarily focused on reliable defense, with blocking strikes and counterattacks as its key elements. Recalling his past life, the young man realized that he had previously studied only the basic elements of this technique, without grasping its true essence, for a certain more subtle element was required. Professor Daniel sincerely praised the students' magnificent techniques, noting that they seemed polished from the very beginning. The protagonist self-critically noted that his strikes were, after all, very easily parried, acknowledging his teacher's superiority. Daniel suggested moving on to a more serious level of training, while the exhausted Rudd tried to catch his breath, sitting on the floor. The tired student, looking at his teacher with bewilderment and a touch of anxiety, asked him to clarify what he meant by a more serious level, unable to imagine what could possibly be more difficult. Daniel explained that the blue sky technique involves not only mastery of the sword, but also a unique control of mana, accessible only to the true successors of the style. The professor continued, explaining that mana is pure life force, usually stored in the heart, but the blue sky technique uses a different special method. Gould demonstrated a mana seal that appeared on his hand, shaped like a snowflake, explaining its significance in the technique. The teacher spoke of the heavenly spirit, a subspace where practitioners of the technique accumulate vast amounts of mana using a special energy channel. Upon hearing about the heavenly spirit, Rudd recalled that his brother had possessed a similar ability in his past life. Daniel explained the method's effectiveness, noting that the presence of mana in the heart could diminish its role as a conduit, and asked if Rude had studied other methods of energy control. Donatos firmly confirmed his lack of experience, recalling that in his past life, he had used a conventional method based on the system of ethical circles, reaching his maximum potential in mana control. The professor suggested that Rudd personally try out the new method, asking him to sit down and choose a spot for the imprint. After a moment's thought, the student indicated the desired spot for the seal, preparing for the unknown experience. Daniel warned of a possible slight tingling sensation and reached out his hand to the student, preparing to begin the mysterious ritual. Rudd trustingly placed his hand in his teacher's palm, and Gould, using the finger of his other hand, began to create the magical seal. Contrary to his expectation of a slight tingling sensation, the young man felt an unbearable burning, as if his hand were on fire. But he heroically held back, so as not to scream in pain. A mysterious silhouette gradually manifested on Donatos's hand, radiating a powerful, pulsating energy. Stunned, Rudd watched as pure mana began to flow from his hand, forming a radiant halo of unprecedented power around him. The young man gazed upward in awe, watching as the legacy of the ancient receivers, passed down from generation to generation, materialized in the air. Donatos realized that before him lay the result of centuries of effort by masters who had dedicated their lives to creating a blue sky with the help of mana. Suddenly, a mysterious voice behind Ruda called him a youngster, causing the student to spin around abruptly. Donatos had a strange sensation, as if the whole world had been turned upside down, plunging him into a new reality. Waking up in the familiar training hall, Rudd heard Professor Daniel ask him about his impressions of his first encounter with the blue sky. The stunned young man admitted that the experience had been truly amazing, while Gould compared mastering mana to the emergence of a new, unexplored organ in the body. Daniel explained that it usually takes a considerable amount of time to get used to the new sensation and begin to use mana effectively, as he watched Rudd's attempts to stand up. The professor noted with surprise that the student had not only managed to stand up, but was already demonstrating a confident sense of mana within his body. Gould was stunned to realize that the young man was not merely sensing, but already controlling the mana descending from the blue sky, just a few minutes after initiation. A question flashed through the teacher's mind about the true nature of his extraordinarily gifted student. Rudd, closely examining his hand with the manifested mana, recalled how in his past life, while learning the standard method of handling energy, a ring would appear in his heart, reflecting his level of mastery. Donatos noted to himself that the level of mastery of the blue sky technique was manifested through the number of wings. His teacher had 6, and the legendary master of the heavenly sword, his brother, had 7. Rudd set himself the ambitious goal of achieving 8 wings, striving to fulfill his brother's dream and surpass the previous limits of mastery. With trepidation and hope, Rudd looked at his hand, eager to see the result of his first attempt at the new technique. To his surprise and slight disappointment, Donatos discovered only a single wing on his hand, realizing that the path to mastery would be long and difficult. Daniel explained that the mana seal was indelible, as it was bound to the soul rather than the body. And even after the recipient's death, their memories and powers would return to the source. Rudd, gazing thoughtfully upward, noted that in the realm of the celestial spirit, he had seen Daniel's teacher and the mysterious stranger, but not his brother. Donatos suggested that if the seal truly remains on the soul, perhaps the celestial spirit preserves memories of his brother after traveling back in time. The young man realized that the teacher had said nothing about the possibility of imprisonment in other dimensions, which heightened his suspicions. The only lead left was his brother's disappearance, along with the celestial dragon Sartnan, which required further investigation. Stepping out into the courtyard, Rudd heard a question about the reason for his late arrival, finding his friends waiting for him. Hennis, standing next to Balak, reminded him irritably of how every second counted for the education of their clueless comrade. Donatos calmly replied that he had finished on time, puzzled as to why his friends hadn't left without him, to which Hafley objected that she couldn't handle the dumbass on her own. An offended Balak flew into a rage, shouting that he wasn't a dimwit, while Hennis reminded him that he risked having to repeat the year because of his behavior. Steros, without stopping chewing, remarked that as soon as the lecture began, he was ready to pass out, demonstrating his attitude towards studying. Balak suddenly suggested that this might be a psychological attack using magic, but the expressions on his friends' faces made it clear just how absurd that idea was. While Steros was thinking about preparing his muscles for an imaginary psychological attack, Hennis asked Rude about his sessions with the mentors. Donatos replied briefly, "Nothing special," omitting the teacher's heightened interest in his abilities. A memory surfaced of an enthusiastic Professor Winston, marveling at Rudd's incredible achievements during training. Ms. Claire also expressed genuine admiration for the technique Donatos had invented on his own. Hennis, not believing her friend's words, reminded him of the unique opportunity to study under all the curators and asked if perhaps he had managed to see Professor Damien without his mask. Rudd replied vaguely, mentally reconstructing the image of the enigmatic professor. His memories transported him to the spacious office of the Class D professor, known for his silence. The protagonist settled into a chair across from Damien, who had remained silent for a full hour the last time they met. The young man mused that if they had known each other before, they could have discussed current events. But because of their rare meetings, he knew nothing about his interlocutor. The young man recalled that, among all the teachers, this professor was the first to die in his previous timeline. Damien's unexpected question about the tea caught Rudd off guard, nearly causing him to choke on his drink. The student politely praised the tea's aroma, to which the professor shared information about its popularity in the empire. Paradoxically, Damien himself didn't take a single sip, after which they spent another half hour in complete silence. After mulling it all over in his head, Donatos told his friends that he had simply drunk the tea and left the office, without going into the details of the strange lesson. Hennis, disappointed by the boring story, headed for the door but was stopped by Ruda's unexpected question about their mentors. Balak enthusiastically shared his impressions of Professor Claire, whom he considers a strong warrior worthy of respect, as well as an admirer of muscular beauty. Rudd noted to himself that this wasn't surprising, since in their past lives, Balak and Claire had gotten along well because both of them had nothing but muscles instead of brains. When it was Hennis's turn, she complained about a terrible experience with a substitute teacher who had criticized the effectiveness of fire magic. The girl angrily recounted the advice to master another type of magic so as not to reach the limit too quickly, and added that he wasn't fit to hold a candle to the Empress of the White Flame. Balak, sitting down at the table, tried to calm his classmate, noting that the teacher's words made sense since fire magic was quite rare. Halfley, now even more angry, snapped, "What do you know?" To which Rudd tried to support her by suggesting she switch classes if she didn't like the teacher. The girl said sadly that it was useless, since there wasn't a single fire mage among the professors at Iradium. The young man jokingly suggested that perhaps the Empress of the White Flame would come to teach here, specifically to instruct her. Puzzled, Hennis asked what nonsense he was spouting, but her question was interrupted by the appearance of a stranger who addressed the group of friends. Rudd, turning around instantly, clearly expressed his displeasure at the sight of the approaching young man. The young man, coming closer, greeted Rudd and reminded him that they had already met during the entrance ceremony, introducing himself as Jeremy Duville, president of the student council. Jeremy unerringly identified Hennis and Balak, impressing the girl with his knowledge. Donatos asked suspiciously if the president had really found out everything about them in advance. The student council president amiably explained their fame as an inseparable trio of freshmen. While Hennis seethed at Rudd's latest audacity, Duville noted Ruda's particular fame, having been chosen by all the professors, which caused outrage among the upperclassmen, who considered it unfair. Donatos asked directly whether Jeremy had come as a representative of the dissatisfied upperclassmen to voice their discontent. The student council president hastily refuted this assumption, raising his hands in a gesture of friendship and suggesting there were valid reasons for the professor's decision. Duville remarked that, on the contrary, he liked such outstanding personalities as the protagonist, but the latter clearly detected the sarcasm in his words and barely restrained his anger, clenching his fists. Jeremy asked if Rudd would like to join the student council, mentioning their constant shortage of members. Donatos, demonstrating his superiority and unwillingness to kowtow as his interlocutor had done, declared that he didn't like the idea of being an errand boy. The young man was angered that he was immediately viewed as a potential mercenary, with hardly any other options offered, which heightened the tension between them. Jeremy, pretending to be speaking at random, noted that he seemed to have hit the nail on the head, further fueling Donatos' animosity. The student council president noticed the small scratches on Rudd's hands, speculating about his difficult past as a mercenary. Donatos warned Duville that he was going too far, but Jeremy continued, mentioning his fascination with detective stories, and that he even knew about the search for Rudd's brother. The protagonist thought irritably about Jeremy's obnoxious behavior, as he spoke as if he knew everything in the world. In his past life, the president was known among mercenaries for his rare perceptiveness. But now the true face of this monster is clear. Although he is not a villain, he behaves in the most selfish and self-assured manner for the benefit of the absolute majority. Rudd stated that although he wasn't one for playing detective, he too knew a thing or two about Duville. For instance, that he took far too much interest in other people's affairs. The young man added that the president mistakenly believes that with such a brilliant mind, he is capable of controlling people as if they were his lapdogs. Duville noted Rudd's obvious hatred but expressed interest in him, to which Donatos replied that the president was only interested in people of significance. As he left, the boy emphasized that he had absolutely no interest in Jeremy, disappearing among the rows of books in the library. His friend was very ashamed of his companion's behavior, so Hennis approached Jeremy and apologized on his behalf. But he assured her that everything was fine and there was no need to worry. Noticing the book on the table, Jeremy assumed he had interrupted the class, apologized, and decided to leave, out of politeness. Halfley, seeing her friend approaching her with the book he had been searching for so persistently, was outraged by his behavior, reminding him that Jeremy was, after all, the student council president.